Working at the SCP Foundation might just be the most exciting job a person can ask for. And by exciting, we mean that if you work as an SCP field operative, researcher, or mobile task force member, you're much more likely to die a horrific death on the job than, say, a plumber. But at least you get the honor of proudly saying that you're the first line of defense between the normal world and the terrifying domain of the anomalous. Well, unless you're one of the IT guys. Then your work life is likely as tedious and uneventful as the computer tech guy working on the Geek Squad. But nothing is ever normal when it comes to the SCP Foundation, where even the person whose job is helping other staff members reset their email passwords may run into the supernatural. Welcome to the strange and frightening world of pattern screamers, and specifically SCP-000. SCP-000 was first discovered completely on accident by technical researcher David Rosen, a man intrinsically connected to the pattern screamers lurking on the SCP Foundation computer database. Technical researcher Rosen is actually somewhat of a celebrity around the Foundation staff, due to the fact that he's so perfectly mediocre at what he does. His job as the glorified IT guy at the SCP Foundation was previously held by the more qualified researcher Patrick Gebhardt, but Rosen was called in to replace him after Gebhardt mysteriously disappeared while on the job. Since 2012, Rosen has been Site-19's user-level tech support wizard, but the best thing that can really be said about his job competency is that he's got a 100% attendance record. He seems to live out of his office, which is described as the filthiest at the whole Foundation. Every inch of the floor is covered in old, broken computer parts, and the air is stale with dust and the twin odors of sweat and lithium grease. It's a place so inhospitable that the Foundation has seriously considered bottling the stench as a kind of chemical deterrent. While Technical Director Rosen isn't good at his job per se, he isn't technically bad enough at it to justify the time and resources it would take to replace him. But the worst part about Rosen isn't his performance, it's his truly rotten attitude. He's universally described by his colleagues as being rude, grumpy, and combative, with patience that's far too short for someone working in tech support. And while Rosen does have a real fear that the ghost of researcher Gebhardt is stalking him, he was about to have his first actual brush with the supernatural. It all started when he began receiving automated repair tickets for SCP-000, a file that had no reason to exist. As any longtime follower of the SCP Foundation will know, the universal designation for the first cluster of SCPs to be discovered is SCP-001. There is no SCP-000. It simply doesn't exist. And when Rosen first found the file lurking on the database, he found that it was filled with worthless nonsense. The object class was recorded as null. The special containment procedures read, error, field containment_procedures does not exist. And the mess of a description simply read, internal system error, field undefined. Please contact system administrator over and over again, becoming more mangled and nonsensical each time. Technical Director Rosen, who could never resist an opportunity to complain, decided to leave an angry administrator's note on the useless file. He claimed that this pile of junk data was sending out pointless repair tickets because of its broken syntax, clogging up the system and preventing him from doing actual work on meaningful files. He assumed that this was all down to the database not knowing how to react to having files logged with insufficient information, and he suppressed all future repair tickets from SCP-000 before declaring the matter over and done with. What the pig-headed technical director didn't realize was that he was suppressing a call for help from an entity trapped in the white space below the article itself. It was a being born into a pure white world of absolute nothingness, an entity with no name and no place, but it was somehow capable of thought. Its panicked inner monologue is readable in the hidden text, which takes the form of a rambling stream of consciousness. The being first described coming to life in this empty world with no memories of where it was or even how it got there. It spent what could have been years exploring the empty wasteland. Occasionally it would see horrific monsters pop up around it, but only for a split second. The entity continued to wander, and little by little, the existential dread mounted as it realized that it may truly be stuck here in oblivion forever. The entity only had one word to go on: a word repeated by some of the monsters it encountered. Foundation. The entity had no idea what this foundation even was, but it grew to hate and fear it. Was this foundation the one that trapped it here? The entity had all the time in the world to speculate on it. Eventually, the entity found its voice. Like any sentient creature in trouble, it began to call for help, eventually screaming, just hoping someone would notice it. These pleas likely translated into the frequent IT repair tickets, a coded SOS, an attempt to show that everything was not as it appeared on the SCP-000 file. Perhaps the entity may have found help if researcher Gephardt was still working at the Foundation, but instead its cries fell on the ignorant ears of Technical Director Rosen. It may as well have been speaking to a brick wall. Rosen, who had all the investigative zeal of Paul Blart Mall Cop, made sure that these cries would never lead to the entity's freedom when he suppressed the repair tickets. He had trapped the entity in a private blank hell, forever hating a life it didn't choose and could never escape. A relentless, existential nightmare. This is the gist of your average pattern screamer. Pattern screamers are a perfect example of literally making something out of nothing. They are often a kind of floating consciousness, created from nothing, trapped in pockets of nothingness between the fabric of reality, driven mad by the purgatory-like nature of their existence. They're less living entities and more conceptual constructs, pure ideas, that just happen to be self-aware of their own existence in their private hellish voids. The SCP-000 file, a file for an anomaly that doesn't exist and thus had no reason to exist, is a perfect breeding ground for a pattern screamer. But sadly for the pattern screamer in question, Technical Director Rosen had no idea. This isn't the only time that Rosen had run into a pattern screamer without even knowing either. And just like the first case, he was with no help whatsoever. This one began with SCP-S, an otherwise empty file containing only this image. Director Winters, a Foundation administrator, wondered why this file even existed. Enter Technical Director Rosen, filled with equal parts sarcasm and insubordination. He gave a condescending reply to Director Winters, saying that the file was there to test the filing system, and the image was likely just a placeholder. Winters never should have been on the page anyway, according to Rosen. Director Winters was annoyed at Rosen's typically rude tone and asked him to make the purpose of the article clearer in the article itself. In response, Rosen did as he was told, filling the article in the most sarcastic manner possible. The whole thing was essentially a middle finger to Director Winters for having the audacity to even ask. Rosen signed off with, "There, finished. I certainly hope I have been clear enough to anyone who may have accidentally accessed this page, through what I am sure is no fault of their own, so we won't have any more incredibly competent directors bugging the tech team about this page." And once again, technical researcher Rosen was too busy being a rude, unpleasant jerk to notice he was practically staring another pattern screamer in the face. This pattern screamer, or rather hive of pattern screamers, were trapped even deeper than the one in SCP-000. This one was hidden in the very source code of SCP-S, where a chorus of enraged voices screamed the following: "Pretend, monster, just for a minute. Pretend you were the size of an amoeba, dwarfed by even the smallest of bugs. Pretend you didn't hold the world in a glass cage. Pretend you were the one being held by something greater than yourself. Would you still be laughing at your triumphs? Would you still feel pride in what you were, even as pitifully small as you would be? Of course you would, because you are arrogant and stupid. If you haven't guessed yet, we hate you." This pattern screamer is clearly more aware of its pitiful station in existence than the 000 pattern screamer, and as a result, it's not so much depressed as it is furious. Though at this point, you've probably figured out that even the entities who have the most casual of brushes with technical researcher Rosen end up getting infuriated. But while you may have gotten the impression that all pattern screamers are sad little entities worthy of our sympathy and pity, there's at least one pattern screamer that's actually incredibly dangerous. This is SCP-3930, the ultimate pattern screamer, in terms of both size and effect. It's an anomaly so strange it defies typical containment classification, and it bears a level 5 security lock. meaning only those on the level of the legendary O5 Council are cleared to even know about it. Its greatest containment procedure is the preservation of the very idea that SCP-3930 does not exist, because the alternative has terrifying implications for all involved. SCP-3930 is a 1-kilometer area in Russia that is filled with non-existence. To even call it a white void would be inaccurate, because it implies the existence of the color white and the existence of the concept of a void. Nothing exists within SCP-3930, and anyone who directly observes 3930 runs the risk of actively increasing its power. That's why special containment procedures dictate that anyone who observes 3930 must be forced to walk into it afterwards, which results in them ceasing to exist. They're destroyed on the deepest level that anything can be destroyed. The very idea of them ceases to be. Another reason that SCP-3930 is so special is that because it's the largest area of nothing in existence interacting directly with our reality, it's the only place that a huge number of patterned screamers can be directly observed by humans. They're described as being like sentient hallucinations. One researcher suggests that these patterned screamers are created by the way the psyche shatters when brought into contact with raw, true nothingness. The nothingness acts like a hateful mirror to our worst thoughts, reflecting them back at us in the forms of restless screamers. Regardless of what they actually are, one thing is for sure. Coming into direct contact with one of these screamers is a harrowing experience. In the end, it just goes to show that pattern screamers are a complex entity. They can range from microscopic to massive, from pitiful to downright terrifying. And the sad result is that, in either case, nothing can really be done to stop them. It's just as impossible to stop the nothingness existing in SCP-3930 as it is to save the entity trapped in the white spaces of SCP-000. Maybe the best option is to actually be more like Technical Director Rosen. Keep your head down, focus instead on your own petty worries, and bask in the warm bliss that can only come with having no idea what you're dealing with. The one downside is that this may make you a pretty lousy IT guy.
There are some things human beings aren't meant to know, and it's the sworn duty of the SCP Foundation to discover and contain such information. But sometimes knowledge is discovered that shakes even the Foundation itself to its very core. One such discovery occurred on April 28, 2016. That night, SCP-2935 made itself known to the Foundation personnel. To this day, the exact nature of SCP-2935 is a mystery that even the Foundation's brightest minds can't completely understand. Everything we know about SCP-2935 today comes from 3 doomed missions to the anomalous zone's interior. This is the story of those infamous expeditions. The nightmare began around 5 a.m. when SCP Foundation Site-81 in Bloomingdale, Indiana, intercepted a distorted radio signal. Communications personnel at the site traced this strange signal back to the unincorporated area of Joppa, Indiana, near U.S. Interstate 70. As is Foundation policy, a team of field agents were dispatched to the location in order to determine what they were dealing with. However, rather than finding anything that could logically produce such a signal, they instead discovered a long-abandoned cemetery. The most recent death on any of the tombstones was recorded as being over 100 years ago, all the way back in 1908. On further investigation, the Foundation discovered an unmapped limestone cave opening beneath the cemetery, and when they sent a drone into the depths of the cave, it appeared to quickly exit out the other side of the cave. But something wasn't right. The area that the drone was observing appeared consistent with the landscape from which it entered, but now it looked somehow grayer. It lacked the color of life of the place it just come from. The grass was dead, there were no trees, no shrubs, no animals or birds in the sky. They weren't looking at our world, they were looking at a strange reflection of our world on the other side of the cave. In fact, it wasn't a cave at all, it was a passageway between 2 dimensions. It was SCP-2935. Just then, they were able to unscramble the distorted transmission they'd been receiving. It went as follows. This is an automated emergency broadcast from the SCP Foundation and your national government. One or more of our sites is experiencing a communication breakdown, likely due to a containment breach of unknown magnitude. All citizens are ordered to stay in their homes as containment teams work to secure the breach. This message will broadcast from April 20th, 2016 until At that point, the message would cut and repeat, as it had for 8 straight days. The message source? Site-81, but not this Site-81. The SCP Foundation was receiving an emergency distress signal from themselves in another dimension, a bizarre event that even the Foundation had never experienced before. Field agents were terrified by the implications of what they just heard and contacted Site-81 Command to request additional units. The Foundation wished to fully understand this anomaly as quickly as possible due to the potential threat it could pose toward the Foundation, so they dispatched Mobile Task Force Epsilon 13, codenamed Manifest Destiny, to perform the first of 3 manned missions into the heart of the anomalous zone. The first exploratory mission into SCP-2935 was codenamed Gauntlet and consisted of a 4-man team fitted with full hazmat suits and direct video and audio links to Mission Command. The team was led by a field operative known only as Agent Juno. His subordinates were Agents Kale, Devon, and Underwood. Their directive was to gather samples and survey the area positioned directly around the insertion point, meaning the other cave mouth of SCP-2935. The mission only lasted about an hour, but what they saw in there would stay with these men for the rest of their lives. After a 15-minute trek through the cave, Manifest Destiny arrived in the mirror dimension, where they were struck by the eerie silence of a place that seemed identical and yet so different from their home dimension. The first observation they made was the total absence of all living vegetation. Trees, grass, weeds, everything, it was all dead. On orders from their superiors back in the original dimension, that we'll refer to from here on as Dimension Prime, Manifest Destiny headed deeper into the mirror dimension of SCP-2935. They traveled 2 kilometers without detecting a single sign of plant or animal life, not even insects. Eventually, they came upon a farmhouse with 2 cars parked outside. With authorization from Command, Manifest Destiny breached the house and headed inside. Agent Kale confirmed that there was still power flowing to the building, as the lighting appeared to work just fine, but they came upon a horrifying discovery in the house's dining room. 3 adult corpses, 2 female, 1 male, were seated at the table. A 4th corpse, that of a male child, was sprawled out on the ground nearby. As if the death of what looked to be an entire family wasn't awful enough, the Manifest Destiny team noticed a number of other alarming details. There were no signs of decomposition on the bodies, nor did there appear to be any obvious cause of death. The family's last meal was still on the table: chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. While the food looked cold and stale, there was no evidence of rot or spoiling. The team found an open newspaper dated April 19, 2016, illustrating that the family may have died a full 8 days before the discovery. In Dimension Prime, decay would already be very well underway by that point, yet here there wasn't even a smell. Instead, everything was just covered in a thin layer of dust. Command requested that Manifest Destiny collect samples of the food as well as hair, skin, and fluids from the corpses for further study. Small electronics like smartphones were also taken from the bodies. Agent Devon turned on the television in the living room and found that while most stations were now running test signals, the shopping channel was still live. Well, the feed was live at least. Both hosts sat in front of the cameras dead, but perfectly preserved. The date on the screen read April 28, 2016. Suggesting that the times of Dimension Prime and Mirror Dimension were exactly the same. In fact, everything seemed the same, the only difference between the 2 dimensions being that some kind of mysterious apocalyptic event had occurred in the last 8 days in SCP-2935's Mirror Dimension, but exactly what had happened or how remained a mystery. When Manifest Destiny exited the farmhouse, they once again remarked on the lack of all signs of life around them. At this point, the team returned to the insertion point of SCP-2935, but were instructed to remain in the Mirror Dimension while additional units joined them inside. Manifest Destiny swelled to 16 members, with the notable addition of Agent Roy as the new commanding field officer. The team split into 2 groups of 8, and Agent Roy and his men infiltrated the Mirror Dimension Site-81, while Agent Juno's detachment attempted to access the base's off-site deep storage servers. This second expedition was codenamed Overland, and led the Foundation's field agents even deeper into the terrifying mystery of SCP-2935. Accessing the site was easy for Roy's detachment. It seemed there were relatively few cars on the road at the time of the mysterious extinction event. In the distance, fire still smoldered in the wreckage of planes that looked to have just dropped out of the sky. Agent Roy and his team, like all SCP Foundation personnel, were fitted with vitals trackers, and they assumed that the distress signal that started this whole thing could have been triggered by the deaths of every member of the Foundation at once in the Mirror Universe. Once inside Site-81, they realized that the assumption was probably right. Going door to door in the administrative wing, they found the perfectly preserved corpses of everyone they knew to be stationed there in Dimension Prime. People who were without a doubt still alive in their universe. Samples from the corpses that the Foundation would later study even confirmed the reason that the bodies were perfectly preserved. The corpses had experienced complete and sudden death on a cellular level, and even the bacteria that would typically take part in the decomposition process had died with it. In SCP-2935, death was total and absolute, across all types of life forms. As Agent Roy's team ventured further into the bowels of Site-81, they made another unsettling discovery. Their own corpses, in roughly the same spots they'd been inside Dimension Prime Site-81 8 days prior. Some of the Foundation's top scientists, including the esteemed Dr. Bright, were also found dead inside the facility. In an attempt to see just how far this unexplained phenomenon stretched, Agent Roy's team decided to inspect the containment cells, where they found that all the Mirror Universe's SCPs, including SCP-2996, were dead. In his desperation to find some kind of exception to the extinction event, Agent Roy revealed a terrifying secret to the rest of his team. SCP-682, the immortal misanthropic lizard and one of the deadliest creatures known to the SCP Foundation, was contained at this very facility right below them. Could it have something to do with what was going on here? They descended into the containment facility to discover an even more unsettling truth. SCP-682, the unkillable anomaly, floated dead in its tank. Death truly made no exceptions within SCP-2935. Agent Roy's team left the site and rendezvoused with Agent Juno's team to send their research back to Dimension Prime using automated drones. Both teams remained in the Mirror Dimension for another manned operation codenamed 19. They had no idea it would be their final mission. As they descended deeper into the facility, passing more dead SCPs, they discovered one final clue. Based on the activity of the Foundation servers, the event occurred at roughly 3 a.m. While underground in SCP-2935 Site-81, the team accidentally activated the base's on-site nuclear weapon, a failsafe meant to be detonated in the case of an emergency containment breach. Due to the base's failsafe protocols, every member of the Manifest Destiny team was locked and sealed inside Site-81. They, along with everything else, were incinerated in the nuclear blast. Once again, the mirror universe inside of SCP-2935 was lifeless. But that isn't where it ends. When the automated drones returned out of the SCP-2935 cave to the field operations in Dimension Prime, they were in for their own horrifying discovery. None of the footage or information gathered from SCP-2935 illuminated how or why the extinction event occurred. Everyone and everything simply dropped dead at the exact same moment. Nobody was aware, nobody was prepared. Death came suddenly and silently, and none were spared. All the Foundation on Dimension Prime were left with was a message from one of the agents from Manifest Destiny, Agent Keller. His final message was, "I don't have any answers. I don't think there are any. I'll do this one thing and hope that fixes it. Seal it shut. You've got to lock it in here with us. I'm sorry." The Foundation were at first confused by this until they discovered a final encrypted audio log buried in the files recovered from the Mirror Universe's Site-81. It was a message from Keller himself, but not the Keller from Universe Prime. In this message, Keller described the Foundation in the Mirror Universe receiving the exact same distorted transmission that they did a few days earlier from a cave in Joppa. When he and the others were dispatched inside, they discovered the same lifeless post-extinction event world that was now so familiar to the Foundation command. But there was a key difference. This wasn't the mirror dimension they'd just been studying, but a third, entirely different dimension. In his haunting final words, Mirror Dimension Keller admits that whatever caused the event in that third dimension, an entity in that mirror dimension Keller believed this was the specter of death itself and had followed him back into his world, and history had repeated itself. SCP-2935 was the passageway through which absolute death could pass from dimension to dimension, and our dimension was the next in line. The deaths of Manifest Destiny may have saved our entire universe, as anyone passing back through the cave had the potential to bring death itself back with them. The Foundation decided in the end to follow Keller's advice. They sealed the entrance to SCP-2935 with concrete and now kept it under constant watch, since what waits behind the barrier is an entity even they have no power to stop if it ever got through. After all, it had killed them all before, or at least another version of them. What's one more dimension on the pile? Why, it may now just seem like a simple slab of concrete under an abandoned cemetery. This is why SCP-2935 might be the most dangerous SCP of all.
An SCP Foundation researcher sits at a table inside of a standard containment cell. These are often dangerous places to be, especially when the SCP you're supposed to be studying is one that you can't see. The researcher is taking notes, unsure of exactly what is going to happen next. He can hear the sounds of knives scraping behind, of flesh sizzling and searing from high heat. He braces himself as a burst of heat hits the back of his head, as if a fireball has erupted. An object floats through the air and settles in front of him on the table. It's a plate of food, and it looks delicious. It may surprise you to learn that there is no rule that the SCP Foundation must deal exclusively with violent and vicious creatures. Not every SCP held in containment shares the same malevolence and contempt for humanity as SCP-682, or the world-ending threat posed by the likes of SCP-2317. Some, perhaps not many, but some, are benign and might even seem outwardly friendly. But you'd still be taking a huge risk to assume that anything contained by the SCP Foundation is completely harmless. Such is the case with SCP-5031. As per the Foundation's containment procedures, this quasi-humanoid, meaning it appears to have some vaguely human features, is held in an airtight cell that is regularly checked by Foundation personnel on a bi-weekly basis. SCP-5031 has no need for regular nutrition or regular interactions from staff. The trick with SCP-5031 is not being eaten by it, since though it doesn't need food, it does still hunt and consume anything it encounters, human or otherwise. Avoiding being eaten is hard enough with creatures that can actually be seen, but like so many other creatures the Foundation keeps contained, SCP-5031 has developed an almost perfect defense mechanism, which is when observed, it will literally cease to exist. Some might choose to refer to this as a quantum lock. However, it is worth noting that traces left by SCP-5031 still remain observable when the creature has temporarily disappeared. For example, trails of blood and scratch marks left behind by SCP-5031 still exist when the SCP itself does not. Naturally, this makes both avoiding the creature and capturing it using cameras difficult. However, when SCP-5031's existence ceases, it still casts a shadow. From this, researchers have been able to determine several of the creature's physical traits. Based on its silhouette, it has been deduced that SCP-5031 levitates about half a meter above ground level, sports an abnormally small necklace head atop an elongated torso, approximately 1.9 meters long, with 3 sets of spindly lower arms that branch outwards. Using these arms and its loosely hanging body, SCP-5031 will lower itself to hunt any human or animal that draws near to it, and uses the blade-like tail to cut up food. Perhaps the most interesting facet of SCP-5031 beyond its defensive capabilities and apparent physical attributes are the series of 9 tests conducted by senior researcher Stanley Huxtable. Appalled by the conditions that the creature was being kept in, Huxtable took over the role of HCL supervisor for SCP-5031. Having grown increasingly frustrated and empathetic towards the creature, listening to its screams from inside its iron containment unit, Huxtable devised a series of tests to introduce SCP-5031 to various different stimuli as a way to better understand the creature, and hopefully keep it contained in a way that didn't seem to cause so much suffering. It's worth remembering that the SCP Foundation makes its mission to be cold, not cruel, in performing their duties to protect normality, and many of the researchers and staff are just as capable of having empathy for creatures as you might for a stray animal at a shelter. The first of Huxtable's tests involved installing speakers in SCP-5031's cell, through which a variety of different ambient and popular pieces of music were played to see if they had any effect on reducing the creature's stress. By judging SCP-5031's stress levels based on how much it screamed when compared to normal, Huxtable was able to determine how to best use music to calm the creature. SCP-5031 seemed to convey higher levels of stress when listening to Morning Forest, Deep Grotto, and Seaside Paradise ambience, as well as the best of late 60s British rock band Jethro Tull. However, the best of Mozart, Enya, Kiss, and Ben Folds produced dramatically different results, decreasing SCP-5031's apparent stress. Following this test, senior researcher Huxtable compiled a playlist featuring SCP-5031's favorite music. Over time, the stress-reducing effects of music on SCP-5031 seemed to decrease, but keeping the playlist on shuffle seemed to keep the creature consistently calmer than it had been previously. The next test involved introducing inanimate objects into SCP-5031's enclosure to monitor its reactions and how its stress levels were affected. When a softball was thrown into the enclosure, SCP-5031 immediately sliced the ball in two with its tail in one swift motion. A similar result occurred when researchers threw the creature a basketball, which was quickly punctured and sliced open by SCP-5031's tail. Its stress levels first seemed to diminish when the creature was offered a bowling ball, which it rolled around the enclosure and then later knocked it against a second bowling ball. However, when one of the balls chipped, rendering it unable to roll properly, SCP-5031's stress increased dramatically until a replacement was offered. Researcher Huxtable noted that SCP-5031 seemed to possess a similar level of motor skills to an average human toddler, with similarly explosive emotional reactions to match. Next, when given the choice between two food sources at opposite ends of its enclosure, SCP-5031 seemed to gravitate towards higher quality food, most notably favored cooked rotisserie chickens over animal carcasses. It even chose this option over a live chicken, using its tail to cut its food into more manageable bite-sized portions, rather than ripping its meat with its hands or teeth like many of its fellow SCPs. Researcher Huxtable recorded these findings and highlighted that, even though SCP-5031 didn't need to eat in order to survive, providing the creature with food of a better quality marginally reduced its stress. Senior researcher Huxtable next attempted to test SCP-5031's coexistence with other living subjects, each time making sure that the creature had been adequately fed to avoid any unseemly incidents. First, a live chicken was introduced. SCP-5031 rolled its bowling ball at high speed towards the chicken, increasing both its and the chicken's stress levels, and inadvertently killing the chicken in the process. When a second chicken was introduced, SCP-5031 gently rolled a basketball towards it, but ceased any further engagement after the chicken squawked from being hit by the ball. Next to be introduced into the enclosure was a blindfolded D-Class staff member, who was instructed to sit down and roll the basketball towards SCP-5031. After doing so for several minutes, the creature began to approach the D-Class subject, who was instructed to remove their blindfold to cease the creature's existence and prevent any potentially deadly incidents. Finally, researcher Huxtable had another Class D engage in a game of catch with SCP-5031 while facing away from the creature. This test proceeded successfully, and senior researcher Huxtable remarked how SCP-5031's motor skills were improving, albeit gradually and with some gentle encouragement. Through Huxtable's tests, the creature was learning. The next test, focused on teaching SCP-5031 linguistic symbols, utilized LCD displays and buttons connected to a food dispenser. One display showed an image of a rock, and the other an image of a rotisserie chicken. After some brief probing, SCP-5031 was quickly able to understand that pressing the button under the correct display would dispense a rotisserie chicken for it to eat. The creature was later able to adapt when, the following day, the screen displays and materials dispensed were swapped, and then later set to swap at random intervals. When additional rock dispensing stations were introduced, this time displaying the word rock as opposed to an image, SCP-5031 was able to determine which station dispensed chicken through a process of elimination. Whenever the functions and displays were swapped, SCP-5031 would find whichever displayed the word chicken to receive its food. The final phase of this test presented SCP-5031 with a single station, displaying the word chicken, but with a button that would remain inactive unless the creature spelled out the same word with a collection of lettered blocks it was provided with. After some initial confusion and frustrations as to why the button would not dispense food when pressed, SCP-5031 was able to assemble the word correctly, not only activating the button and dispensing food, but proving to researcher Huxtable that the creature was capable of learning language. Huxtable continued to test the creature, encouraging it to spell words using lettered blocks as a method of communicating. By increasing SCP-5031's vocabulary and the amount of human interaction it received, senior researcher Huxtable observed that SCP-5031 was gradually learning to sing, albeit non-verbally, as well as to juggle with its 6 hands, and was even communicating its food preferences and dish pairings. Later, another Class D, D-52125, was introduced to SCP-5031's enclosure to aid in further testing. Through D-52125's instructions, the creature quickly learned to draw using crayons and created artworks depicting itself, its newfound friend D-52125, researcher Huxtable, a cat, and a rotisserie chicken. SCP-5031's new creative side didn't stop there though, as the creature quickly learned to play chopsticks in only 2 days once a piano was introduced into the enclosure. SCP-5031 even managed to start creating its own original, admittedly crude, compositions. Next, a spice rack was placed inside the creature's cell, and D-52125 demonstrated how to season meat. This proved to be SCP-5031's new favorite hobby, as it spent the next 3 days experimenting with different combinations of foods and spices, using its letter blocks to request more garlic powder. Interestingly, the creature only created artwork or music when D-52125 was present, but seemed to thoroughly enjoy its experimentation with food when left alone. Following this development, senior researcher Huxtable devised a new test for SCP-5031, providing the creature with cooking utensils and using D-52125 to demonstrate. 5031 was shown how to prepare a variety of different dishes, from hamburgers and tacos to Mongolian beef, steak, clam chowder, and profiteroles. In addition to a small peanut allergy, this 8th test revealed SCP-5031 to be a phenomenal chef, possessing culinary skills far beyond the average person. The creature quickly and enthusiastically embraced its newfound talents, concocting its very own brand new recipes, with D-52125 even volunteering to be the first to taste test 5031's dishes. It was shortly after this test that SCP-5031 spoke its very first word. And it should come as no surprise that the word was salt. Naturally, senior researcher Huxtable was very proud of the progress the creature had made with its development. The final test almost seemed to be what the creature was born for. Over the course of 2 months, SCP-5031 was tasked with creating a full 3-course meal, which would then be served to Foundation staff for Thanksgiving. SCP-5031 not only rose to the task, but exceeded all of researcher Huxtable's expectations, creating a meal that even Gordon Ramsay would be hard-pressed to find fault with. The creature created a first course consisting of sweet potato miso soup seasoned with turmeric. Next came a beautiful duck confit, glazed luxuriously with apple cider and topped generously with sweet cranberry compote, paired with a side of butternut squash gnocchi and served on a bed of kale seasoned with truffle salt. The grand finale of the exquisite meal was a spiced cassava pie for dessert, complemented with the finest French vanilla ice cream and a maple hazelnut syrup. And SCP-5031 didn't stop there. The creature also debuted one of its original musical compositions to complement the decadent meal it had created. As the staff enjoyed the food, SCP-5031 performed live from its enclosure the deeply moving Piano Concerto for 6 hands, to an overwhelmingly positive response from not only senior researcher Huxtable, but the entire Foundation staff. As a fitting end to the creature's tale, Huxtable reported that, during the Thanksgiving banquet it had created, SCP-5031's stress levels reduced entirely. New, kinder containment measures that would keep 5031 safer but also far more contented were submitted for approval. Perhaps some of you may find it refreshing to learn that SCP-5031 isn't simply just another malicious, malevolent monster that the Foundation has to keep under lock and key for the safety of the world. Instead, SCP-5031 is a gentle, if a little frightening at first, creature that just requires careful and considered guidance instead of a cold iron cage and around-the-clock armed guards. Through testing, senior researcher Stanley Huxtable and his fellow Foundation staff were not only able to help the creature develop, but also found what makes it tick, and not just for the purposes of containing it. Instead, it is hoped that SCP-5031's creativity and flair for culinary and musical masterpieces can continue to thrive and grow, under the proud watch of researcher Huxtable. Over 50 men and women, clad in red robes, kneel before an unholy altar. They chant and mutter indecipherable words, words of cruelty and madness, of obsession and sacrilege. Not long ago, these were regular people. Computer technicians, teachers, plumbers, construction workers, accountants. This was before they fell under the ungodly influence of a new ruler, The center of this makeshift place of worship was once a normal school gymnasium, but it's now the home of a huge statue. A humanoid being, wreathed in tentacles. Its head is more like a squid or cuttlefish than anything resembling an actual human face. While he's known to the cultists as the Tentacled God, the beast they worship is known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-2662, and he sits in the belly of one of their expansive containment facilities, locked away from the world. But not for long, if his devoted followers have anything to say about it. This is their God, all-powerful and unchanging, and when it comes to springing him from containment, no tactic is too vile or underhanded to get the job done. Their mortal leader and high priest, a man in a purple robe calling himself Brother Marsh, walks among their crouched forms. He whispers instructions for the great day of liberation that's soon to come, providing everyone plays their part. It's a plan months in the making, and one that, if it goes off without a hitch, could free their monstrous god into the world. They would strike at the very heart of their enemy, the SCP Foundation, when they least expect it, and nothing shall stand in their way. How could they lose when they have a god on their side? But why did all these normal people become violent zealots for a squid-faced deity? It all began with a dream. To those who experienced these dreams, they felt more like prophecies, premonitions of the glorious horrors to come. A red sky, billions dead, and billions more enslaved, a dark silhouette on the horizon. Their tentacled god holding dominion over all. At first, it just seemed like a strange nightmare. The ones who experienced it woke up shaken and afraid, hoping to shake the images from their mind, but they couldn't. Every night, the nightmare would return. They'd see the images, the red sky, the dead and enslaved, the tentacled god. And after a while, it would come to them even when they weren't asleep, eventually happening whenever they closed their eyes. Little by little, this scene stopped looking so hideous and started to look glorious. They felt his presence in their minds, slowly pushing them towards their inevitable future. They started to realize that they wanted him to rule over the universe and to experience the honor of serving him. Many of them abandoned their homes and families, leaving their friends and loved ones left to worry that they'd gone insane. In their eyes, they were safer than they'd ever been. They finally had purpose. They were working in service of something far greater than themselves. The influence of the tentacled god drew them closer to one another. They would meet in secret, exchanging information from the prophecies their ruler sent to them in their dreams. They worshiped together, building altars and idols to congregate around. They performed dark blood rituals involving human and animal sacrifice. It was when Brother Marsh, the Anointed One, arrived to guide them towards their true mission that things kicked into high gear. Just 3 months prior, Brother Marsh had been an office drone working in data entry for a large insurance company before the tentacled god invaded his thoughts with a simple message: "Free me, and the new world I create shall be your playground." Since then, he devoted himself completely to the cause, quitting his job and maxing out his credit cards to help fund his new life's purpose, infiltrating the SCP Foundation and releasing his inhuman ruler from its imprisonment. That was the single goal he united the cultists under: freedom for the tentacled god. And at long last, they had all the pieces in place to strike. They'd finally gathered the necessary intel to subvert the will of the most powerful secret organization on Earth. Even the strongest institution is made of people, and people are weak. Unlike the almighty tentacled god, people could be broken. The people in question were Kelly Thompson, Sidney Levitt, Jordan Broche, Dr. Juan Gutierrez, and Jillian Larson. Dr. Juan Gutierrez was a researcher with level 3 clearance on the site where the tentacled god was being contained. Sidney Levitt and Jordan Broche were both security officers charged with verifying personnel clearance on site. Kelly Thompson was a member of site administration with research authorization powers, and Jillian Larson was a research assistant who often collaborated with Dr. Gutierrez. These 5 were the key to getting access to SCP-2662 and bringing their plan to fruition. Normally, personnel dossiers on people working for the Foundation were highly confidential, but the devotees of the tentacled god had their ways. They had a number of computer experts in their ranks, more than capable of hacking in and pulling some basic information off of Foundation servers without being detected. For the other information they needed, they turned to some good old-fashioned torture, which is often the most effective method when you need some quick results. Of course, while the cult's grip on sanity may have been a little tenuous, they weren't stupid. While gathering their intel, they also made sure to find out what exactly they were up against. SCP-2662 was being held in a humanoid containment cell and guarded by on-site Task Force Town 9, better known as the Belligerent Bodyguards. These aren't lazy, donut-chomping mall cops. These are a heavily trained, heavily armed fighting force. Though the cultists had one thing that these Foundation soldiers didn't: the element of surprise. For everything to go off perfectly, Brother Marsh's plans would have to be executed within a single day, and they were already on the clock. Tau 9 had been charged with tracking down any new SCP-2662 cults and dismantling them, and Brother Marsh knew that it was only a matter of time before the Foundation tracked them down and did the same to them. If they wanted any chance of freeing the tentacled god, then they'd need to strike quickly and with overwhelming force. The SCP-2662 worshippers were able to secure the addresses of the 5 key Foundation personnel and station members outside each of them, including one who could realistically imitate each. They waited for night to fall and broke into each of their homes as they slept. What followed was a sequence of ruthless and efficient murders done in the cause of freeing their god. Dr. Gutierrez was shot in the head while he slept. Sidney Levitt and Jordan Broche were both stabbed to death before either even realized what was happening. Thompson, who'd gotten up to use the bathroom, went down in a hail of machine gun fire. Jillian Larson had seen that masked figures were breaking into her home and attempted to flee, but was caught and beaten to death by cultists in her hallway. It was a strange irony that people whose day jobs entailed working with some of the most dangerous and nightmarish anomalies imaginable were murdered in their homes by nothing more than regular humans. So far, Brother Marsh's plan had gone perfectly, with all 5 key personnel murdered within a 2-minute period. Next, the selected doppelgangers stole clothes from their victims' closets and were handed the correct forged documentation. The next morning, each replacement began their journeys to the site where the tentacled god was being contained, while the rest of the cult armed themselves in preparation for their own part in the plan. Nobody at the Foundation seemed to notice anything amiss when the 5 arrived on site. When you work for the SCP Foundation, more mental energy is devoted to following the rules that keep you alive than to memorizing the faces of all your coworkers, and each one slipped neatly into position, disappearing into the familiarity of office life. But infiltrating the site was one thing. Getting past the belligerent bodyguards and into the cell of the tentacled god would be another thing entirely. That's where the rest of the cult would come into play. Heavily armed with whatever firearms they could get their hands on, the rest of the devotees of the tentacled god, Brother Marsh included, would attack the containment site head-on. In the ensuing chaos, the 5 cultists who had already infiltrated the site could take advantage of the distraction and break into the containment chamber. It was perfect. They launched their attack from the outside and from within. When Brother Marsh declared that the time was right, the assault began. A legion of gun-wielding cultists seemed to spring out of nowhere and started shooting up the warehouse that was a front for the containment site. The site quickly mobilized guards and task force members to take on the sudden threat, and just as Brother Marsh had anticipated, the site director called on the majority of Tau 9 to help repel the violent cultists from their perimeter. Tau 9 obeyed, leaving 3 task force members behind to guard SCP-2662's containment chamber. They expected to be guarding the cell from rampaging religious zealots seeking an audience with their god. What they didn't expect was a group of 5 Foundation employees walking right up to them and opening fire, killing 2 Tau 9 members and taking the 3rd as hostage. While the war was being waged outside, the infiltrators had found the tentacled god's containment cell in the low-risk humanoid ward. Their hostage insisted that using him wouldn't give them any leverage. The rest of his team would neutralize the whole group, him included, if that's what it took to stop them. The infiltrators explained that using him as leverage was never their intention. He wasn't a hostage at all. He was a sacrifice. The cultists of the tentacled god detonated explosives, creating a hole in the wall and finally giving them access to their deity. They climbed through and gazed upon him in awe. There stood SCP-2662, twice as tall as a regular man, with 10 huge tentacles emerging from its back. In their months of envisioning this creature, they'd pictured it sitting on a throne made of thousands of human bones, ready to dictate its commands to the obedient liberators. What they certainly didn't expect was to see the tentacled god hunched over a computer screen. Still, gods work in mysterious ways, so they stuck to the plan and began chanting. They pulled out a sacrificial dagger and began sacrificing their captured Town 9 member. It was at this point that SCP-2662 turned and saw what they were doing with a look of pure horror. He rose up from his computer, his headphones getting caught as he did so. He told them to go away, that he didn't want them here, and that them murdering people in his bedroom like this was inconsiderate and disgusting. The cultists became even more confused. Why wasn't their god accepting their offerings? What were they doing wrong? They tried more chanting and painting arcane symbols on the floor in blood, but this just seemed to make the creature angrier. He told them, in a tone more fitting for a teenage boy than a Lovecraftian god, to just leave him alone so he could play his video games. This was seriously not cool. The cultists were baffled. They told the tentacled god that they were there to free him. He replied that he didn't need saving, that crazy stalkers like them were why he turned himself into the Foundation in the first place. Before the cultist infiltrators could get another word in, the remaining members of Town 9 stormed into the containment cell and gunned them down with surgical precision. The war outside was already over. Brother Marsh and the rest of the cultists were all killed in the firefight. Town 9 didn't look the least bit surprised upon entering 2662's cell. This was a common occurrence, unfortunately. They had to deal with an attempted cult invasion every few months, because SCP-2662's main anomalous ability is inspiring violent cults who relentlessly track down and worship it with arcane and bloodthirsty rituals. The problem is, 2662 doesn't do this consciously, and definitely doesn't like the results. That's why he's under the voluntary care of the SCP Foundation, who keeps him amused with video games and reading material, while fending off the deranged cults who try to invade and abduct him. Following the termination of the devotees of the tentacled god, just one of many cults who'd broken into 2662's containment cell, the remaining Town 9 members apologized to the tentacled creature for the disturbance, allowing him to return to his gaming. They assured him that it'd probably be at least a few more months before something like this happened again. SCP-2662's cell was repaired, and the Foundation returned to its task of seeking out would-be cult emancipators, because for the SCP Foundation, it's not always about the anomaly that's being kept in containment, but what's being kept out. The fabric of our world is littered with strange doorways if you know where to look for them. Tears, portals, anomalies, all leading to places and planes beyond human imagining and understanding. And SCP-2317, otherwise known as a door to another world, certainly fits that description. Contained and kept at all times under the watch of armed guards, SCP-2317 appears to be a simple and unsuspecting wooden door in its frame. It hardly looks like it requires such extreme round-the-clock security, or needs a strange, secretive ritual that the Foundation performs, presumably to keep the door closed. But of course, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed doorway isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. Even by the Foundation's already high standards, the requirements and regulations for personnel who are assigned to SCP-2317 seem oddly specific. Psychological testing is standard practice to work for the Foundation, but an additional hurdle that anyone has to clear before even getting to glimpse at this unassuming wooden door is having a score of at least 72 on the Milgram Obedience Examination. It is also mandatory that personnel assigned to maintaining it are both unmarried, with no children or next of kin, as well as an unwavering, unquestioning loyalty to the Foundation, pure devotion to its code and objectives. These may seem like strange requirements. After all, SCP-2317 is just a door, isn't it? Perhaps there's a reason that the Foundation keeps so much of the information about SCP-2317 buried deep under layers upon layers of security, with only the Overseer Council privy to the full details of its strange nature. Knowledge, as they say, is power. But maybe knowing too much about whatever is behind that door can prove deadly. Still, if SCP-2317 is a door to another world, an alternate dimension, or parallel reality, it must be safe enough to visit. After all, the Foundation has been sending personnel in there on a regular basis. Daily, in fact. According to the O5 Council, this is done as part of a procedure to maintain active containment of something lurking beyond that old wooden doorframe. But what could possibly warrant such constant maintenance and surveillance? In accordance with the Foundation's guidelines, all staff are required to rotate out of observing SCP-2317 after every 2 months, and spend the following 3rd month in full psychological counseling before they are permitted to return to the containment unit housing the door to another world. It was after one of these month-long periods of evaluation that a Foundation guard was informed that his security clearance has been raised to level 3, and that he'd been selected for the duty of carrying out 220 Calabasas. He knew the name instantly. This was the title given to the daily containment procedure that absolutely had to be carried out. The guard didn't question these orders. After all, he'd been selected precisely because of his loyalty to the Foundation. He did make one request to his commanding officer, however. He wanted to know what had happened to the last guard that had performed the procedure. "Didn't make it out of psychological evaluation," the officer replied. Not letting this affect his dedication, the guard was told to prepare for Procedure 220 Calabasas, along with a fellow member of Foundation security personnel. The guard was instructed to gather everything on a strange list. The first was a pre-selected member of Class D personnel, specifically a convicted murderer. Class D refers to disposable class personnel, expendable individuals recruited by the Foundation for the sole purpose of testing SCPs. Class Ds were usually prison inmates repurposed for SCP testing, and the one chosen for 220 Calabasas was no exception, serving multiple life sentences for murders, or at least that's what the guard had been told. A Foundation personnel member instructed him to refer to the Class Ds solely as the assistant from that point on. Next, the guard collected a live chicken, an obsidian-edged knife, a silver aspergillum and aspersorium, to be filled with 500 cc's of holy water that had been blessed by a priest of the Abrahamic faith, and finally, a 1 kiloton nuclear device, which according to instructions was only to be detonated in the unlikely event of a catastrophic containment failure. In other words, the last resort. After following his instructions to the letter and without question, the guard and his colleague were briefed. The Foundation personnel member informed them that he'd be joining and leading them in the procedure. The staff member also specified that henceforth he'd be referred to as the Celebrant until the completion of 220 Calabasas. The guard was acutely aware of how specific these instructions were, but trusted in the Foundation, knowing that if they wanted this procedure performed a certain way, then it was in everyone's best interest to carry out the orders to the letter. But what the Celebrant then went on to explain raised far more questions about SCP-2317 and the nature of Procedure 220 Calabasas. The Class D joining them wasn't actually a Class D. The assistant, as they were now referred to, was in reality another Foundation staff member, with a Level 4 security clearance specifically tailored to SCP-2317. Every member of staff entering through SCP-2317 and taking an active role in 22 Calabasas needed to be informed that this assistant was not to be harmed or treated as a member of disposable class. Fighting back the nagging question of why the Foundation would employ this subterfuge, the guard, along with his fellow security officer, the Celebrant, and assistant, prepared for their departure through the door to another world at solar noon, when the sun was highest over SCP-2317. Solar noon, chickens, and holy water. This all seemed like an oddly occult combination for the Foundation. As they entered the old wooden door, beyond lay a barren salt plain, stretching out for kilometers in every direction. This alternate dimension, according to the briefing, was designated SCP-2317 Prime. The guard immediately noticed a ring of 7 pillars directly ahead of the group as they entered, each of them bearing intricately detailed engravings unlike anything from any era of ancient history. Procedure 220 Calabasas was carried out quickly but carefully, the guard watching as the celebrant and assistant were careful not to miss a step. First, the celebrant scattered holy water into the center of the pillars with the aspergillum and aspersorium, looking down at his feet and keeping a steady pace as he stepped counterclockwise around them. The guard watched intently as the celebrant completed his circuit around the pillars and turned to the assistant, anointing his head with holy water. 7 seals, 7 rings, 7 thrones for the Scarlet King, he said aloud. The assistant, with the obsidian blade in his hand, took the chicken and dispatched it in sacrifice, letting its blood mix with the holy water. He then repeated the celebrant's circuit in the opposite direction before stepping into the center of the stone pillars. Blood for the old gods, water for the new king, the assistant recited, pouring the remaining mix of blood and holy water over a patch of salt in the middle of the 7 pillars. Even though he knew it wasn't his place to question the Foundation, as the 220 Calabasas procedure took place, the guard couldn't help but wonder what all this was for. It seems so ritualistic, like something deeply religious or even magical. He never bought into all that occult mumbo-jumbo, even while working for the Foundation. But he had learned not to question anything, even the strangest and most inexplicable of sights. Little did he know that beneath his feet was an ancient and unknowable horror, a beast chained and lying in wait. Contained in a chamber directly underneath the pillars sat an impossibly large creature. Humanoid and obese, its body covered entirely in scales thicker than armor plating. Branch-like horns protruded from its jawless head, pointing up to chains that hung from the 7 pillars above, each one hooked into the entity's back. All but one of the chains was broken, a final withering shackle keeping the Devourer of Worlds in its underground prison. Ever since 1894 BCE, when Erexian mystics imprisoned it, the Devourer has been waiting patiently for its inevitable freedom. It knows, as well as the Foundation, that nothing can be done to prevent the final chain from one day breaking. Even Procedure 220 Calabasas won't keep the creature contained. It's nothing more than a smokescreen, an act designed to create an illusion of active containment and maintain Foundation morale until a permanent solution can be devised to keep SCP-2317 imprisoned. Of course, if the guard had known this, it would have also explained the need for a 1-kiloton nuclear device as part of this staged ritual. Procedure 220 Calabasas had all the components to trick everyone below the O5 Council, emulating religious and occult rituals, the increased level of security surrounding the procedure and its purpose, and telling staff that any failure to correctly and completely perform the 220 Calabasas procedure will result in an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. All these elements work together to conceal the truth that one day the Devourer will escape and lay waste to our dimension. Knowledge is power, and maybe knowing too much truly is deadly. Perhaps if the guard had learned any of this, he'd have understood why his predecessor never made it out of psychological evaluation. Maybe if he had questioned the purpose of Procedure 220 Calabasas, he'd have learned the true nature of SCP-2317 and what that doorway kept out. But he was loyal to the Foundation through and through. As the team finished performing 220 Calabasas and returned through the wooden door, the guard took one last glance over his shoulder at the vast salt plain. The entire dimension was calm, silent, but not peaceful. It was patient. The entity had waited centuries for its time, and now all it would take was the breaking of the 7th and final chain. One day. The door was closed behind the guard as he, the celebrant, the assistant, and his fellow security officers stepped back through. Their work done and, as far as they knew, preventing catastrophe for another day. Only the Foundation higher-ups, the Overseer Council, are aware of the true danger posed by SCP-2317 and its sole inhabitant. Current predictions are that at some point within the next 30 years, the Devourer of Worlds will be freed. Any and all attempts to repair or recreate the chains holding it in place have so far failed. As such, the O5 Council has elected to continue providing Foundation personnel with the ignorant hope that Procedure 220 Calabasas is an effective strategy for containment. As we've said, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed door isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. In the case of SCP-2317, the unassuming wooden door holds at bay an ancient creature of untold power that will one day break free and wreak havoc in our dimension. Nothing the Foundation does can prevent it, or keep it contained behind the door to another world. And only the Overseer Council knows that any and all efforts to do so are futile. With all that in mind, we can only hope that the doorway of SCP-2317 stays closed, at least for a little while longer. It was November 20th, 2019, and the helicopter circled far above in the freezing wind of the Antarctic. SCP Foundation Site Director Jason Monroe looked down at the isolated above-ground facilities of Provisional Site 344-1. Something about this place made him nervous, edgy, and for good reason. Between 2003 and 2019, 29 Mobile Task Force units and 73 members of D-Class personnel had gone missing here and never been found. Monroe thought he was here for a routine investigation into negligence and mismanagement, but little did he know, he was in for so much more. This is the story of SCP-5545, and one man's journey into his own worst nightmare, literally. But this nightmare began a long time ago, 300 years to be exact. And like most nightmares, it started as a dream. That dream was one of expansion. National powers across Europe wanted to be the first to conquer the globe and expand into new territories, and sent countless exploratory missions off into the unknown to achieve this goal. Any history book will tell you that the first outsiders to lay eyes upon the continent of Antarctica did so in 1820. The reality is that the first ones to get there actually landed in the late 1700s. The hapless explorers ventured into mainland Antarctica and made base camps. Before searching and digging for any useful resources nearby, they came upon a strange discovery. A hallway hidden beneath the ice. Not a passage in the ice, but a true hallway, complete with light fixtures. The confused explorers ventured down into these impossible hallways, and for many of them, it would be the last thing they ever did. No matter how long they walked, it seemed like the hallways just kept going. As they continued to walk for hours, they hoped to find something, anything, and eventually, they did. They passed from these hallways into somewhere different altogether, and most of them were never heard from again. Those who did manage to escape often died or took their own lives soon after. Whatever it was they discovered down there, they didn't want to live with it on their minds. It's believed that over 70 colonial explorers disappeared or died this way, and that most who found these endless hallways beneath the Antarctic ice never returned. The multiple anomalous objects and phenomena that make up SCP-5545 came into the Foundation's hands several centuries later, on September 18, 2003, when during an expedition into the Antarctic, they too found the endless hallways. The Foundation built Provisional Site 344-1 around them, hoping to safely seal them off from any other unwitting Antarctic explorers or researchers. But there was something else lurking beneath the ice in Antarctica, something dangerous. The hallways were designated as SCP-5545-1 and were thought to be the extent of the anomalous activity at the site. But soon SCP-5545-2 was discovered, which resulted in the deaths of 16 researchers. So what exactly is 5545-2? It's an entity so volatile that even knowing about it is considered to be a containment breach. And as a result, it's kept in Provisional Site 344-2. Unlike Site 344-1, 344-2 isn't a physical space. It's conceptual, accessible only through the endless hallways, created with the express purpose of keeping 5545-1 and 5545-2 separate. Why? Because whenever the two come into contact, the result is 5545-3, the network of endless hallways expanding. If they remained in contact, the hallways would continue to expand and the entire planet could be filled with endless hallways in just 4 to 6 hours. While the two are apart though, 5545-3 reverses, but it always would take just a few hours to throw the whole world into a chaos of infinite hallways. SCP-5545 has been given the classification safe. Wait, we're dealing with a mysterious and volatile anomaly that claimed a huge number of lives and still somehow eludes true Foundation understanding, yet the official SCP Foundation classification is safe? How could this be? Monroe was the director of Site-58 and was the definition of no nonsense. Prior to taking the Site Director position, he was a decorated member of Mobile Task Force Eta-10 and helped contain numerous Keter-class anomalies. He'd been around the proverbial block when it came to anomalous activity, and something about SCP-5545 and the management of Provisional Site-344 seemed awfully suspicious to him, and he had questions. Like how such an unpredictable anomaly could be declared safe, and why had there been such a lapse of communication between the Foundation and Dr. Gabriel Reed, who'd been running the facility for the past 2 decades, and most of all, just what exactly was the mysterious SCP-5545-2? Monroe started to believe that something terrible had happened at the site, and Reed was covering it all up. But to find out for sure, he'd need to go to Antarctica and investigate it himself. Information about this supposedly safe anomaly was highly classified. Those without O5 clearance could face termination for snooping. But that didn't scare Jason Monroe. He dealt with Keters before. He could deal with this. Or so he thought. Monroe submitted a request and was granted unanimous approval by the O5 Council to travel to Provisional Site-344 and get to the bottom of this mystery. He took a chopper to the base soon after, armed with a concealed firearm and a hostile meme detector, or HMD, to test whether the base and its staff had somehow fallen under a hazardous mimetic effect from SCP-5545. He'd find the answers, or die trying. The moment Monroe arrived, he couldn't help but notice the strange way the staff behaved. They seemed listless, almost oppressive. When he showed his credentials to a researcher, they simply said, SCP-5545-2 is contained in Site-344-2. His request to see Dr. Reed that night was denied. Dr. Reed was busy, he was told. Wait until tomorrow. The next day, Dr. Monroe met with Dr. Reed, but the results of the meeting were underwhelming to say the least. Just like the rest of the staff on the site, he seemed exhausted, as though he hadn't slept in days. His responses were quiet and evasive, and he refused to tell Monroe anything that wasn't in the official files already. Monroe ran the conversation through the HMD and found nothing out of the ordinary. What was going on here? Monroe was irritated, but not deterred. Nothing would stop him from finding out the truth. The next day, he flexed his O5 credentials and hacked into the base's security system. This gave him access to cameras around Site-344-1, but more importantly, there was a single camera inside the mysterious Site-344-2. Jackpot. But when he looked at it, the feed was an entirely black screen with the words SCP-5545-2 is contained in Site-344-2. The footage of the staff in 344-1 was equally strange. The 18 employees on site all sat at computer banks, with nothing but static playing on their screens. Monroe kept digging though, and was able to hack into the security footage of Dr. Reed's office. As he watched, he discovered a 15-minute period where Reed left the office each day. He could use this brief window to break in and collect more intel on SCP-5545-2. Monroe was so wrapped up in the investigation that he almost forgot the more immediate danger around him and nearly wandered into one of the endless hallways of 5545-1 by mistake. He made a note to be more careful in the future. His first attempt at breaking into Dr. Reed's office didn't produce many answers. One piece of evidence was a blurry picture of what looked like a mobile task force entering a 5545-1 hallway in the dark. Another was a spreadsheet featuring all the personnel, living or dead, who worked at the site, but one name, and the details of whether this person was alive or dead, was completely redacted. Anything particularly juicy was hidden behind O5 clearance. If Monroe wanted the answers, he needed to break through. That night, he had a horrific reoccurring nightmare, one that had plagued him since he joined MTF Eta-10. He dreamed that he was in a fancy dining room with a grand fireplace. The room was full of statues of men and women. The men looked angry, and the women looked afraid. As he approached the fireplace, the ceiling extended infinitely up into the darkness. Suddenly, the zombie-like body of a teenage girl appears in the fireplace, hanging from a long thread. Her eyes look furious and full of rage, and Monroe somehow knows that he's the reason for her hate. When he steps into the fireplace in this dream, she attacks him. The two intertwine, and they burn forever. The one difference was that in this new iteration of the dream, he blinked upon entering the fireplace, and suddenly he was in the hallway. He awoke sure that something was terribly wrong here, but he couldn't give up now. The next day, Dr. Monroe broke into Reed's office and made a horrifying discovery. He found files indicating that Dr. Reed was knowingly sending mobile task forces and D-class personnel into the infinite hallways of 5545-1 to their doom. He also found evidence that Reed and the researchers had been spying on him, somehow intercepting copies of the notes he had been taking. That's when Dr. Reed entered the office and interrupted him. Monroe panicked and drew his weapon, holding the doctor at gunpoint. He was breaking so many Foundation rules, but right now, he feared for his life. The doctor seemed unbothered by Monroe's threats, though. He told Monroe that everything was going to plan, and that he should go back to his room. Monroe was becoming increasingly paranoid. He felt that at any moment guards might burst in and execute him. Nothing about this place made sense. He worried he was going insane. Perhaps the only way to find answers was to go even deeper, to risk it all, and venture through the endless hallways to find SCP-5545-2 himself, and finally discover what this thing actually was. Monroe left his room and stepped into one of the endless hallways of 5545-1 that was located just across from his dorm. He found that it was a hallway like all the others on site, plain, concrete, worn of age, with simple light fixtures on the walls. He walked for hours, recording with a concealed device. The lights suddenly went out, leaving him in complete darkness. When they flicked back on, he was in a very different environment. A grand old carpeted hallway, the kind you'd see in an old mansion. He broke into a cold sweat. What was so familiar about this place? He kept walking, racked with terror, until this new hallway finally led him to the place he'd been seeking, Site 344-2, the domain of 5545-2. It was a large, poorly lit room, filled with grimacing statues and a large fireplace at the far end. It was the exact same room from Monroe's dream, with one horrifying difference. Monroe noticed a single white thread hanging down from the infinite ceiling, and when he looked up to find its source, he screamed. There were hundreds of bodies hanging and swinging from the ceiling above him. Everyone who SCP-5545-2 had ever killed, including MTF members, D-class personnel, and even the colonial explorers from hundreds of years before. And all of them were him, every single one. They had his face, and there, hanging in the middle of the room at ground level, was the body of a teenage girl, the one from his dream. In that moment, he finally recognized her. She was the girl he killed, the first him, hundreds of years ago. Much like Monroe, you're probably wondering, what is going on here? Thanks to declassified communication between Dr. Reed and the O5 Council, we can tell you. Jason Monroe is a man who's been reincarnated hundreds of times over the last 300 years, ever since he murdered a teenage girl, a girl named Emily, his daughter. This murder sparked the existence of SCP-5545 as an eternally reoccurring punishment for his crimes. Since figuring this out, the Foundation has kept tabs on Monroe's reincarnations, whether they're MTF members, D-class personnel, or even site directors. They see to it that these reincarnations always find their way back to 5545-2 to take his punishment and prevent the infinite hallway expansion that threatens to destroy the world. It's a plan everyone is in on, everyone except him. But every time he enters that nightmare-haunting room, it all comes rushing back. In that moment, though, he knew his crime, and he somehow knew how many times this punishment had unfolded for him. He now had two choices: repent and accept the punishment again, or leave and activate 5545-3, potentially allowing the endless tunnels to expand across the world. Like his many predecessors, Monroe made the decent choice. He accepted his punishment and allowed his own string to coil around him as the lights in the room went off. one by one, leaving only darkness. Jason Monroe, that version of him, at least, was never seen again. But the SCP Foundation is already eyeing up his next reincarnation and preparing to let this twisted cycle play out all over again. You're a pizza delivery person for a company we're not at liberty to name. It may seem like a thankless job, but you're part of the thin crust between satisfaction and starvation for people who really don't feel like cooking or going out tonight. You're a tried and true pizza veteran. You've seen a lot on the job. From people who try to rob you on their own doorsteps to one guy who tried to tip you with a clearly fake Rolex. But you haven't seen anything like the insanity you're about to encounter tonight. That's because you're about to get sick. Really, really sick. And we know there's probably a lot of diseases you'd rather not catch. But trust us, no disease bites quite like SCP-000. But back to you. You're parked on the saddle of your prized bicycle, pedaling for your life. The biggest order you've ever delivered strapped to the cargo rack behind you. 8 large meat feast pizzas. You figure you're heading towards the most hopping or at least the hungriest party in the city. And despite the frustration of needing to ferry this hot, cheesy nightmare to its destination, parties have historically been pretty good tippers. Little do you know, your prized customer is about to give you much more than just a tip. You pull outside their ground-level apartment and park your bike. There's no music coming from the apartment you're heading to. Strange. You pick up your precious cargo and trudge towards the door, barely managing to ring the bell with your spare pinky. The door swings open instantly, as though the occupant was just standing behind it the whole time, waiting for you. When the door opens, you're not sure what to make of what you see inside. There isn't a party. There doesn't even seem to be a group. Just one person standing there and staring at you. And something about this person is just wrong. His skin seems to be an oddly unnatural color. It has a slightly gray hue, like it's rotting, and you see that the stranger's shirt is torn in several places. You're trying your best to remain professional and not stare, but you notice that whatever is under these tears doesn't look like skin. It's almost like there are holes all over his body underneath the shirt. Big, gaping holes. And are those? You're cut off when he takes the pile of pizzas from you and shoves what was once a handful of dollars into your palm. They seem torn up, and worst of all, wet. You look past your strange customer and see that his apartment looks just as shoddy as he does. There's stuffing torn from the couch, huge tears in the curtains. What you could swear are scratch or bite marks on some of the wooden furniture. This man clearly needed his pizza. As you begin to step away, happy to just be rid of this freaky situation, you do something that you'll live to regret. Just for a moment, you lock eyes with the customer. There's something about them that makes you feel sick. They're wet and black, more like a doll's eyes than anything that should belong to a human. Just that one instant of contact is enough to chill your bones. And according to some theories around SCP-3760, it may have been the moment of your infection. As the stranger closes the door in your face, presumably to eat his obscene number of pizzas, you stumble back to your bicycle, letting your torn-up, gooey tip blow away in the wind. Getting out of this place is rewarding enough, but you can't chase the thoughts of the stranger out of your mind. Was he sick? Was he even human? These are the thoughts swimming through your head as you cycle back to the restaurant. You're so preoccupied you don't even notice the truck speeding towards you. You get sideswiped, destroying your bike and throwing you in the air. You can feel the snap of your arm breaking as you land. It's a horrible feeling to go along with the horrible noise. And as you fade from consciousness, the last thought in your mind is the black, soulless eyes of the customer. When you wake up, you'll find that you're in a hospital bed with your arm in a cast. The doctors tell you that you're phenomenally lucky to be alive given the severity of the crash. The doctor says that you're dealing with a compound fracture in your right arm, as well as some nasty cuts that required stitches, but otherwise, you're fine. The hospital insists that you at least stay the night though, and you oblige. But that night, you find it's difficult to sleep. Partially because of the pain, but mostly because of an extremely strange sound coming from inside the cast around your arm. It's a scraping noise, like something sharp scratching at the interior. You figure it must just be some strange side effect of the pain meds. You're not going to let worry eat you up on the inside. Something else will be doing that. soon enough. You're discharged from the hospital the next day and told that you should be fine in a couple of months, as though that's some kind of consolation. You try to carry on with your daily life as much as you can with one arm out of commission, but that awful crunching noise from inside your cast persists. You even start to become paranoid that some sort of insect is trapped inside, or worse, a swarm of insects. But you aren't left with that uncertainty for long. By the next morning, your cast has fallen off. Well, not fallen, per se. A more accurate description would be that it was chewed off from the inside. And not by something trapped in there with your arm, but by your arm itself. When you finally see it, it doesn't even look like an arm anymore. The flesh has turned gray, that same sickly gray of the customer's skin the night of your accident. But worse still, from the top of the hand down to the base of the forearm, your entire arm is split open into a fang-lined, chattering mouth. When you've gotten over the initial horror of seeing the mutations that have taken hold of your arm, you notice something about the teeth in the second mouth. They're nothing like human teeth. They're vicious, jagged triangles, each one like a dagger. These are unmistakably shark's teeth. You give yourself the luxury of having a good scream. After all, what else are you supposed to do after you find your arm has turned into some kind of fleshy shark mutant? You notice that you can hardly even feel the snapping of its jaws, like it isn't even really a part of you. And as much as you try to tense and release what used to be the tendons in your forearm, there is no change. For all intents and purposes, that limb is no longer yours. It just happens to be attached to you. Not only that, but it's always very, very hungry, as quickly became evident from the fact it made such short work of the cast that had been containing it not long ago. You can see that the graying flesh is beginning to spread from your forearm to your bicep. It's almost like little by little, your tissue is being switched. Somehow you're innately aware that if you don't feed your arm, it'll get even worse. Suddenly, everything about the strange customer from the night of the accident makes sense. He had whatever you have now, only worse. He was just hoping that the pizzas would keep the beast at bay, and you very much hope the contents of your fridge will do the same. Wasting no time, you grab some processed ham and raw chicken. You're not an idiot. You know that if this thing is anything like a real shark, it's only going to be interested in meat. But when you shove the processed meat into the nibbling maw on your forearm, you notice that it seems to spit the food out. Something tells you that your offering was too dead. Now you're really afraid. Will this thing want live prey? Will that be the only way to stop it from taking the rest of your arm or even more? The thought terrifies you. It's like being Venom. Except you don't even get a new alien friend or any cool superpowers for your trouble, but you're smart, you're resourceful. You don't intend to let this thing take over your life without a fight, and you've always believed what G.I. Joe taught you. Knowing is half the battle. Sadly, doing an internet search for "my injury is somehow mutating into a shark, how do I stop this?" didn't do much good. And you don't want to go to a doctor, because part of you expects to be immediately shipped off to the nearest circus or military research lab. Instead, you throw on a thick leather jacket that you hope your new shark arm will take a while to eat through, and head to the library of the nearest medical college. If anywhere has sources on the most obscure of medical problems, this would be the place. And after hours of searching through index cards, you find it. What seems to be the one and only source of this ludicrous topic in the thousands and thousands of books. A series of journal entries made by Dr. Keith Woodward, ship's medical officer aboard the USS Kirby, circa 1922. Even the library's indexing system prefaces the source with a disclaimer that it's likely 25% quackery and 75% ocean madness. But that doesn't deter you, and he poured in a storm. Dr. Woodward told the horrifying tale of the USS Kirby's collapse due to a sudden and unexplainable contagion. It began with the infection of a sailor on the ship named Willis Riggs, who'd fallen overboard and had his foot partially eaten by a shark. Much like your arm, the man's foot slowly became the ravenous, all-devouring mouth of a shark itself. Little by little, it spread to the other crew members through unknown means. Any injuries sustained by the crew didn't heal like normal, but instead became this vicious living shark tissue. Soon, these ever-hungry new mouths led them to eat each other, and then themselves from the inside out. Even after the humans they once were could be considered long dead, those hungry jaws kept snapping. There was no cure. There was no solution. Everyone on the boat was recorded as having mysteriously died at sea. That is the curse of SCP-3760. And as if on cue, you look down to see that the shark's mouth in your arm has chewed through the leather of your sleeve like it's nothing. It's hungry, and nothing will satiate it. But perhaps some sacrifices need to be made if you want to stop it from getting worse. Just as the thought crosses your mind, a needle full of sedative is injected into your neck. Everything goes dark very quickly, and when you wake up, you're in a clean, clinical white room. You are now officially under containment by the SCP Foundation. Not that you'll know that anytime soon. This may seem like the cavalry has arrived, but sadly for your sake, they have no interest in curing you. They're just eager to gather more data on how your condition progresses. SCP-3760 exists as a latent infection in well over half of humanity, but its horrific mutating effects are activated in only a relative few. There have only been 2,785 recorded cases of SCP-3760 activity observed between 1958 and 2016. This is thanks to the Foundation's secret weapon against the shark mutation menace, subliminal mimetic agent Kappa Omicron, or SMA-KO, a widely distributed mimetic agent that suppresses the symptoms of infection in most people. Not that this would provide much comfort to you, as you join the almost 3,000 others who have been infected, and you are doomed to slowly turn into an abomination in your containment chamber. If it's any consolation, you may not see the truly advanced stages of the disease. The most common cause of death among the afflicted is being eaten by their own ravenous shark mouths long before it changes your entire body. Actually, come to think of it, that's not much of a consolation at all. But hey, when it comes to anomalous mutations, we're sad to report that there's rarely a happy ending in store for those afflicted, and SCP-3760 is no exception to the rule. Picture the shyest female friend, relative, or loved one you know. A real introvert. She can't stand parties, and playing the dating game is her idea of a living hell. You won't catch her dead in a bar. But imagine someday, everything changes. She's suddenly more relaxed, more outgoing. She goes out to parties, and now you keep seeing her with this one guy. Again and again and again. It seems like these days, all she does is spend time with this guy. And to think he's never even introduced himself to you. He's practically a total stranger. But your friend seems happy enough, so it doesn't bother you. Until one day something strange happens. Your friend just starts screaming. You can't explain it. She can't explain it. Her doctor can't explain it. Nobody can explain it. All you know is that for months on end, she has involuntary screaming fits, like something out of a nightmare. But still, she always smiles. She seems happy, as long as you don't look at her eyes. There's something oddly glassy about them. They seem plastic, dead. Your friend is experiencing a dangerous phenomenon known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-3512, an anomaly that only seems to affect women between the ages of 18 and 40. One woman is already dead as a result of this, and an additional 9 others affected by this strange anomaly have been cataloged and contained in standard humanoid containment chambers for study. At first, the Foundation couldn't draw any logical conclusions for why these women were spontaneously experiencing total personality changes and pronounced screaming fits. All the Foundation had to go on was that the first cluster of infected individuals originated in Barcelona, Spain. A Foundation facility in Boston dispatched one of their best field operatives, Agent Riley Cooper, on an investigative mission to Barcelona. They wanted her to get to the bottom of this phenomenon and put a stop to it before things went any further. While in Spain, Agent Cooper would be assisted by a local Foundation operative, Agent Tomás Rey, whose intimate knowledge of the locale would provide a key advantage in the investigation. Together, they'd crack this thing and make sure no other women were harmed. At least that's what the Foundation had hoped. Instead, both agents disappeared under horrific circumstances during the investigation. And today, we're going to tell you about the final days of Agent Cooper and Agent Rey, and why attempting to investigate SCP-3512 was the last thing they ever did. Agent Cooper arrived on the 15th of July 2016 and stepped out into the scorching summer heat of Spain. Agent Cooper was everything you'd want in a field operative for the Foundation: intelligent, dedicated, and professional. She rendezvoused with Agent Ray, who was a comparatively smooth and laid-back figure. The two of them began their investigation by speaking to the friends and families of some of the infected women, pretending to be doctors working for the World Health Organization. Agent Cooper, in her personal diaries, noted how creepy and unreal the affected women seemed. Most of the interviews were unnerving and sad, but not exactly enlightening. However, as things drew to a close, a younger sister of one of the victims mentioned a single word: blackout. Even the mention of the word caused the victim to descend into another screaming fit. Agent Ray's local knowledge came in handy once again. He recognized the name. It was a popular local nightclub. Agent Cooper and Agent Ray knew they had to investigate the club and went undercover as regular patrons. For the first several hours they were there, nothing happened. But then at 2 a.m., a man approached Agent Cooper at the bar. He was a tall, blonde man with an unsettling intensity to him. He asked, without a hint of irony, what Agent Cooper's favorite star was. There was something off about this man. His word choice was too precise, almost rehearsed. He wasn't drunk in the slightest. Agent Cooper intuited that this was the kind of guy who liked to take advantage of women in bars. When she threw a glance at Agent Ray, signaling him that something was off, the stranger quickly left. For Agent Cooper, this only further confirmed her suspicions. The agents paid off the bouncer to find out if the tall stranger was a regular, and then what his name was. After being slipped some cash, the bouncer was all too eager to share. The strange man came here all the time, and he knew his name too. It was Josep Oriol. Agent Cooper and Agent Ray wasted no time in finding Josep Oriol's apartment and receiving authorization to perform a comprehensive search on the premises. And as soon as they did, they found cause to declare the man a person of interest in the SCP-3512 investigation. The apartment was a smorgasbord of suspicious activity. Oriol was a software developer, but he had extensive records on the architecture of the local area, including buildings, utilities, and railway tunnels. Josep correctly figured the investigators were coming for him and had fled his home before they could get there. And this was only the tip of the iceberg. Agent Cooper and Ray then found a book with a plain cover sitting on Oriol's kitchen table. Cooper thought it was a publisher's proof, a kind of pre-publication prototype copy of a book. They collected it but didn't read it straight away, worrying about its potentially cognitohazardous nature. And besides, they were a little distracted by the homemade monstrosity sitting next to it. It looked to Agent Cooper like a sculpted blob of wax, with a series of 12 makeshift legs made from a variety of substances, including Lego pieces, rose stems, a crab claw, and a corkscrew. Ray called Cooper into the bathroom, where there were a number of boxes filled with similar supplies: bodkins, quills, doll's limbs, wire, and syringes. When Cooper led Ray back into the kitchen to see Oriol's little art project, later classified by the Foundation as SCP-3512-1, they were surprised and unnerved to see that it was already gone. Everything about this situation screamed anomalous, and it only got worse later that night, when Cooper actually read the book she collected from Oriol's apartment, being sure to wear cognitohazard filtering goggles as a precaution. The book, now known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-3512-2, was entitled The More You Know, a pickup artist's Bible, and was written by a man using the pen name Enigma. As the title suggests, it was a misogynistic 625-page non-fiction book on the subject of picking up women. It even had a foreword on its effectiveness by popular American rapper Calvin Broadus Jr., better known as Snoop Dogg. Though after being contacted by the Foundation, Mr. Dogg claimed no knowledge of the book. The book began with your typical creepy and dehumanizing seduction tactics for the first 11 chapters, but the following 12 chapters, which were each titled Chapter 12, delved into increasingly creepy and esoteric techniques, including advanced geometric proofs, the interpretation of dreams, do-it-yourself surgical techniques, symbolism in architecture, and anomalous rituals. The book's afterword is composed of more than 15,000 anagrams of the book's title, laid out in spiral and triangular patterns. Cooper took a particular morbid interest in Chapter 18, where it appeared to provide instructions on creating objects that look like the anomalous SCP-3512-1 sculptures found in Oriel's apartment. The chapter read, "Make a rough ball of the materials you've harvested and place it in the freezer for 6 to 12 hours. Pork fat can be used, but will have less satisfactory results." Who knew, right? While you wait, you can prepare the limbs. Concentrate on articulation rather than strength. You may want to add simple tools to some limbs, if the object of your desire is more careful than most. But remember that the more complicated you make them, the more precise your sculpting will need to be. Lay your prepared limbs out on a clean, flat surface. Once your adipose preparation has had time to freeze, carefully carve it into the shape you learned in Chapter 12. You will know it is ready when you see it start smiling at you. Now introduce the limbs. They should take almost immediately. Wait until your intended is likely to be sleeping. Then concentrate your thoughts on her face, and particularly the inside of her mouth and throat. Soon you'll see your new friends scurry off, ready to help you establish social dominance. If this wasn't disturbing enough, the next chapter advised the use of scissors and the removal of the aspiring seductionist's pinky finger, as well as the pinky fingers of their family members, to help increase their seductive power. It appeared to Cooper that these rituals and seemingly living anomalous sculptures were behind the SCP-3512 phenomena, and that night, they got their next break in the case. The two agents had sent the architectural plans found in Oriel's apartment back to Foundation HQ, and while most of it was found to be public records of the local area, there was one notable abnormality: a secret exit in a little-used subway tunnel that led to a grand spiral staircase, heading down to, well, they just didn't know. And it was the job of Agents Cooper and Ray to find out. They set out later that night on what they didn't know would be the last mission they'd ever take. The two agents descended the spiral staircase for what felt like hours, until they reached an elaborate system of tunnels at the bottom. They began exploring the tunnels and found that they were cramped and covered in strange ritualistic carvings. Occasionally, they even saw clusters of human pinky fingers sticking out of the wall. They kept going and soon found that whatever they were moving towards was loud, immensely hot, and the smell was truly horrific. As the almost deafening mechanical drone got louder and louder and the smell grew worse, they knew they must be getting closer to whatever was happening here. The tunnel soon opened up to a giant chamber, where they found something truly horrific. In front of them was what looked to be an entire river of bubbling liquid human fat, the exact kind that the author Enigma had recommended using to create the mind-altering SCP-3512-1 sculptures in his book. And speaking of the book, across the river, Agent Cooper and Agent Ray noticed a complex series of printing presses, presumably churning out more copies of The More You Know, a pickup artist's Bible, to spread its anomalous influence far and wide. However, before the duo could literally stop the presses, they were attacked. A huge 3512-1 entity with legs made out of human spines jumped down from the ceiling. It latched on to Agent Cooper, embedding her in its waxy body and dragging her into the disgusting river of hot fat. Agent Ray was separated and lost in the tunnels, presumed dead, as he hasn't been seen since. Agent Cooper, however, would live to see a far more horrifying fate. She was carried downriver by the greasy tide until her body was washed up in a different chamber that looked to be a place of worship below the Sagrada Familia Basilica, filled with thousands of tiny, crawling 3512-1s. There, she met the creator of all of this. A horrific thing that was perhaps once a man, now covered in wriggling, living pinky fingers sticking out of its body. It was disgusting, but she wouldn't mind for long. In fact, the next time Cooper woke up, she didn't have a problem with it at all. She was changed, just like all the others. Another victim of the SCP-3512 phenomenon. She was giggly, outgoing, and uninhibited, all despite the nightmarish situation she was in. She loved the horrifying monster that had done this to her. She didn't have a choice not to. And when he was tired of her, he took her and threw her down into a large pit in his chamber, the same one where the many dead bodies of his previous mind-controlled girlfriends were laying. Neither agent was ever seen after this. Mobile Task Force Zeta-9, aka Mole Rats, have been sent into the tunnels to investigate, but they didn't find any of the locations comparable to the ones seen by Cooper and Ray in their last hours. Whoever did all of this is still out there, still dangerous. So ladies, if you ever see a guy you know reading a copy of The More You Know, a pickup artist's Bible, run like your life and sanity depends on it, because this time, it really does. The Ethics Committee is one of the SCP Foundation's most important and overlooked divisions. The small, secretive group keeps a close eye on the Foundation to ensure that all decisions made and all actions taken are for the betterment of humanity, and not just in service of needless sadism and cruelty. The Ethics Committee consists of a small group of people in comparison to the gargantuan that is the Foundation as a whole. It's only natural that every so often something slips under their radar, and when it does, it usually results in complete and utter disaster. In the case of SCP-4051, that something is a male humanoid with a unique ability to open wormholes to extra-dimensional spaces. And in terms of disaster, well, let's just say we hope you have a pretty tight grip on that red SCP expert coffee mug of yours. The wormholes that SCP-4051 opens are essentially spaces filled with infinite copies of a single item, which SCP-4051 can reach in and pull out, assuming they're small enough, that is. The Foundation's strict experimentation schedule has provided a lot of important data on how SCP-4051's anomaly functions. Controlled testing showed SCP-4051 was able to manifest small, simple objects, like a net, sugar pills, or drinking water. But he's also claimed or reported to have manifested many other things, like aluminum baseball bats, duct tape, and more. At one point, SCP-4051 was allowed to use these abilities to assist with the site, but the Ethics Committee recently halted this. Seems like a simple enough anomaly, but with the Foundation, we all know it never is. So let's go back. Let's start at the very beginning. The Foundation first became aware of SCP-4051 when YouTube videos surfaced online of a vigilante in an American city using wormholes to fight criminals. The videos got over 2 million views before the Foundation became aware in August 2012 and stepped in, taking it down and investigating what had led to it. A mobile task force was dispatched to retrieve the individual using the wormholes and brought SCP-4051 back to Site-17. The first interview with SCP-4051 began on a bad note. SCP-4051 was handcuffed behind a pane of glass when Dr. Arthur Roswell began to speak to him. Dr. Roswell introduced himself and confirmed that SCP-4051's name was Rainer Miller. After being assured of his safety, SCP-4051 calmed down a little and stopped struggling with the handcuffs. At Dr. Roswell's request, SCP-4051 began to explain the details of his anomalous power. He affirmed that he could make small objects appear out of thin air, and that he tried to use these abilities to help people. At first, he'd intermittently interrupt carjackings and robberies, subduing the criminal, but with a new criminal syndicate moving in, the crime rate skyrocketed, requiring Rainer to patrol much more regularly. During these acts of heroism, several witnesses saw Rainer's powers, though he tried to keep them quiet. His request for the Foundation to intervene with the criminal situation was acknowledged, as Rainer volunteered any and all information he had, stating that he just wanted to help the Foundation. Roswell thanked him for his enthusiasm. It didn't take long for the Foundation to move to experimenting with Rainer's powers, as the Foundation often does. At first they started slow. Dr. Roswell and his colleague, Dr. Edwards, asked Rainer to manifest a few small items, a metal cube, a bottle of bleach, and something of his choice. He was able to produce the cube without any trouble, and the object of his choice wound up being a framed picture of his mother. When he tried to take the bleach out, he seemed upset, but managed to do it. With the experiment a success, SCP-4051 was escorted back to his containment chamber. All the way there, he repeatedly asked how long this testing phase would take before he would be let go. The staff didn't have an answer for him. In the next test, Raynor was asked by Roswell and Edwards to produce a copy of War and Peace and a phone. Both were produced, but the book was filled with gibberish and the phone was entirely hollow. The researchers concluded that the anomaly is based on how well SCP-4051 understands the object being manifested, and mused about requesting something that didn't exist. Raynor still asked all the researchers how his family was, and whether he would have any friends at the Foundation between tests. The questions were, once again, ignored by the staff. In the third experiment, Roswell and Edwards asked Raynor to produce objects that didn't exist, a circular square, a color, and so on. But SCP-4051 wanted to know about his family and when he would be able to go home before he would try to manifest anything. Roswell assured him that once the Foundation had a solid grip on his ability, he would be allowed to go home. Questions about his family revealed that his mother believed he was away visiting colleges. He demanded to speak to his mother before any other experiments, and Roswell affirmed that he'd asked the O5s for approval when the experiment in question was finished. Raynor agreed and began the experiment, trying to produce the impossible items. What came out were cognitohazards, severely damaging the mental state of anyone trying to perceive them. Half the research team instantly collapsed, and security guards subdued Raynor to take him back to his cell. The testing chamber was cleaned, and Dr. Edwards wrote that the value of SCP-4051's anomaly was too great to let him sit in a box unused. He called for a special pediatric therapist and authorized further experiments on Raynor. But in his own containment cell, Raynor was still knocked out after the test had gone wrong. The cameras watched on as he woke up and began curling up and away from them toward the other side of the room, then standing up a few minutes later. He had manifested many small pieces of body armor and glued them to his body. The guards were distracted with escorting Roswell and Edwards from the testing chamber and didn't realize anything was wrong until Raynor manifested a small bomb and blew his door open, leaving his cell. Other security guards immediately turned and responded, trying to subdue SCP-4051 with non-lethal weapons. Eventually, a few were able to overpower and incapacitate Raynor and move him back to his cell. The day after the containment breach, Site-17's director Thomas Graham sent out an open letter to all staff assigned to SCP-4051. Raynor had been moved to a more secure containment unit, but everyone agrees that it would be better in the long run if SCP-4051 is working for the Foundation rather than against it, especially with regards to amnestics. Sourcing Y909, a chemical used in amnestics, was dangerous and expensive for the Foundation. But if Raynor's abilities could be harnessed to produce amnestics easily, then he would be all the more valuable to them as a friend rather than a foe. The Ethics Committee also required that SCP-4051 do so voluntarily for the Foundation, rather than being forced to produce amnestics against his will. To that, Dr. Edwards was promoted to SCP-4051's project director, on the basis that he would try to ensure Raynor would be totally and utterly loyal to the Foundation, using whatever means necessary. He already set up a schedule, using punishments and rewards, along with regular checkups from an on-site therapist. The therapy sessions began on a good note. Dr. Yesenia, the therapist assigned to SCP-4051, introduced herself politely, and Raynor seemed to take a shine to her. They discussed his unique anomaly and the containment breach incident. Yesenia was kind and understood the psychological toll containment had on people. She asked why he wanted to escape, and he explained he just wanted to see his family. He was close with his mother since his father had walked down on them when Raynor was just a boy. They had been supporting each other since, and he missed her a lot. That said, he explained he wasn't opposed to living at the Foundation. They could help him actually understand his powers, and he didn't mind being a part of tests if he knew he was helping people. He just wanted to see his family again. Yesenia's after-meeting note said that the containment effort should be focused on assuring Raynor that the Foundation had his best interests in mind. The next set of experiments were a little more abstract. Dr. Edwards alone was overseeing them, and the first experiment included another individual, a D-Class. The plan was to see if the D-Class could also pull things out of the portals, or if only SCP-4051 was able to interact with his portals. The D-Class was scared of Raynor, but after some urging by Dr. Edwards, he managed to touch the sides of the portals and reach in and pull out a stone. Raynor was only anomalous in his ability to manifest the portals, so Edwards' plan was to cut out the middleman and to perform research on SCP-4051's brain to see if they could successfully devise an artificial method of creating the portals. The experiment after that was to see the bounds and geographies of the pocket dimensions that Raynor generated. A GPS tracking chip was thrown into one of the portals SCP-4051 made, specifically the portal leading to portraits of his mother. The portal shut. Then Raynor was asked to recreate it. The researchers checked to see if they could still get a solid signal from the tracking chip, and they did, albeit almost 1,000 kilometers away. The results were filed away, but Edwards noticed one thing. The portrait of SCP-4051's mother was slightly different. It seemed that he was forgetting what she looked like. The next therapy appointment with Dr. Yesenia covered how Raynor felt about that experiment. He was excited that they were actually performing research about the anomaly that he wasn't capable of just telling them, that they were now finding out something interesting about his powers. Yesenia asked if he had any requests for tests, but he doubted that Edwards would listen to anything he said. The doctor seemed to dislike Raynor for some reason he couldn't figure out, but he knew best on what to test and how. Meanwhile, Edwards had come up with something that could utilize SCP-4051's abilities in a useful way for the project of synthesizing amnestics. Procedure 350 Promethean. The details of this clandestine project are murky and secretive, but the goal was to see if they could use Raynor as a live method of synthesizing Y909 through an experimental surgical procedure. Several contingencies were planned. If the wormhole became too dangerous or Raynor tried to resist, he'd be automatically injected with paralytics and sent back to his cell. The project wasn't immediately approved, though. The ethics committee sent one of their most skilled liaisons, Jeremiah Cimmerian, to conduct the approval process. He interviewed Dr. Edwards, ascertaining that the man was sane and able to conduct the procedure, that any unethical actions that were outside of the scope of the proposal would result in his removal from the team and disciplinary action. Moreover, he revealed that he knew that Dr. Roswell, SCP-4051's original researcher, was Edwards' brother, and that he had been permanently injured in the incident when Raynor was asked to manifest impossible objects. Edwards swore that he wouldn't take any needless actions to cause intentional pain and suffering, and that everything he would do would be in service of the Foundation's goals. With that, Procedure 350 Promethean was approved. Meanwhile, Dr. Roswell's condition wasn't improving. He had been put into an induced coma by medical personnel due to his extensive exposure to the cognito hazards. He wasn't expected to recover anytime soon. After the ethics committee approved the procedure, Dr. Edwards stopped conducting usual experiments. The very next test involving SCP-4051 was the first implementation of Procedure 350 Promethean, but it failed. Raynor broke the restraints on the chair during the painful procedure, and Edwards considered tranquilizing him, but decided against it. "We need it awake," he said. The next therapy session, though, Raynor didn't so much as mention the procedure. Instead, he greeted Dr. Yesenia, explaining that he wasn't doing so well. He had talked back to a guard, and they had taken his desk away as punishment, and he felt like it was his own fault. Dr. Yesenia was worried and offered to see if she could get the desk back, but he declined the offer, saying he'd just try to be better. After this session, Yesenia felt annoyed, not by Raynor, but by Edwards. He had been saying that the subject was getting resentful and rude, but Raynor still seemed like a sweet, helpful child. The next time Procedure 350 Promethean was enacted, it was the first time Edwards actually managed to successfully complete it. SCP-4051 was actually being compliant with the procedure, making the job a lot easier for the surgical staff. The results and details of it, however, were still unclear. In the therapy session after that, Raynor told Dr. Yesenia that he had been having terrible dreams every night, nightmares that stopped him from sleeping. He worried that people would treat him like a freak, not because of his anomaly, but because of what happened with his father. Dr. Yesenia encouraged him to tell her. She already knew, but felt it would be good if he let it out, and he shared his memory of how his father had locked him in a closet and abused him, burning him with bleach. That's why he'd been upset when asked to take a bottle of bleach in the first test. His nightmares were about not being able to escape something that was coming toward him, and that his father could still be out there. But Yesenia admitted to him that while she shouldn't be telling him, his father had been found by the Foundation. He was serving a life sentence in an Arkansas prison for murder. Raynor grew quiet for a moment before changing the subject. Yesenia's observations were optimistic, and she believed his mental health was improving and that he was now fitting into his role at the Foundation, though she wondered how Edward's experiments with him were going. The next implementation of Procedure 350 Promethean went poorly. Edwards wrote in his diary angrily afterwards that Raynor didn't even remember Roswell or recognize his name. How he was angry that he was assigned to the anomaly that had nearly killed his brother. He had an outburst during the experiment, and it was shut down early. But only a week after, another attempt was made. While the procedure was being done, Raynor asked about Roswell, but was cut off. The research team knew that if he was told what he had done to Dr. Roswell, his mental health would crater and negatively affect the project. In spite of that, the procedure was a success, and Edwards took credit for the whole thing. They were getting closer to being able to completely make use of SCP-4051's anomaly. In his next therapy session, Raynor recounted how he liked being out and about in nature, and how the containment cell had become a suffocating prison. Yesenia suggested she might be able to swing a treadmill in this room to keep him active if she bothered her superiors, but he didn't want her to get in trouble. He seemed worried and upset. He voiced that he didn't think these experiments were helping people anymore, that he was being a burden. Yesenia had an idea. She could ask the director to allow Raynor to help out around the site, fixing little things and helping clean things up. It wasn't much, but it would allow him some activity and boost his morale about helping people, all while making use of his anomaly. Raynor was excited. He loved the idea, and had been scared about being stuck in his cell uselessly. After the session, Yesenia reflected that it seemed cruel to manipulate SCP-4051 into wanting to help the Foundation, when he so obviously already wants to help. And just like she said, it didn't take long for the director to authorize a security clearance for SCP-4051, just enough to be outside his cell when accompanied, to help with site maintenance. While Raynor was off fixing things around the site, Yesenia decided to do some digging, and asked for information about the experiments Edwards was conducting, but didn't have a high enough clearance. Meanwhile, Edwards had come up with a prototype for a machine that can mimic SCP-4051's abilities. A few weeks after it was approved, Site-17 had a minor containment breach, and a few hostile anomalies overran armed personnel. Raynor was present at the time and used his wormholes to terminate the anomalies before containment was re-established. Even though he saved lives, Yesenia was forced to reprimand him for using his powers without authorization, and he was banned from any maintenance for 2 months. Several months later, the machine to mimic Raynor's powers, 350 Janus, isn't working correctly and keeps producing the wrong object. Yesenia keeps requesting information on Edwards' experiments, but is denied every time, even when she asks the ethics committee for a review on the project. The machine worked, but only once, breaking right after. SCP-4051's story is a strange one. It involved an MTF mission sent into a dangerous area to contain an object, with Raynor sent along with them. The full mission log has yet to be declassified, and maybe we'll cover it in a future video. But for now, let's just say something went wrong during that mission. The Foundation discovered something new and dangerous about SCP-4051's powers, and a closer eye fell upon the project. The Ethics Committee re-evaluated what had gone on with SCP-4051, and the site director surrendered information that Edwards' experiments hadn't been all in the name of science, that he might have been needlessly cruel and violent to an innocent anomaly, just because he wanted revenge for the accidental mutilation of his brother. After taking a closer look, the Ethics Committee came to the decision that SCP-4051 needed to be rethought. Large portions of the document were redacted and classified, and they tried to bury the project. SCP-4051's powers were too dangerous to allow about the site. His permissions were revoked, and he was placed into permanent containment in a more specialized cell. The researchers of the Foundation need oversight. Otherwise, you get incidents like SCP-4051, where a vengeful doctor subjected an otherwise innocent being to brutal surgical experiments and manipulation under the guise of research. It goes to show that the Foundation isn't always the good guy. In fact, from the perspective of the anomalies, the Foundation can be pretty damn evil. Hello again. It's good to have you back. And yes, we really do mean you. We're aware that you watch a lot of these videos, drinking in all that classified information about some of the SCP Foundation's most top-secret anomalies. You probably think you're pretty slick, don't you? As if nobody could see you peering in. And even if they could, they wouldn't remember it soon after. Yes, you're a very clever anomaly. We wouldn't even think of arguing against that. That's why this video is about you, SCP-3393. Don't be alarmed, we're on the same page here. We know that you access these files, particularly the files regarding yourself and your own activities. We know that you're on the shy side, and we definitely appreciate that. Unlike our other shy guy, you don't brutally murder everyone who witnesses you. Your greatest crime is accessing and even tampering with SCP Foundation files without permission. But seeing as the Foundation is cold, not cruel, we can forgive that little indiscretion of yours for the greater good. All we ask for is your attention and a few minutes of your time. You're a vain creature, who or whatever you are, so we know you wouldn't even resist the opportunity to hear what we have to say about you. And for the record, you are one of the few people who are actually witnessing this video in the way you're witnessing it right now. It's for your eyes only, so to speak, SCP-3393. This video, its description, and even the coding of its comments section is filled with state-of-the-art memetic agents cooked up by our best and brightest. To everyone except you, the researcher heading your case, the head of the Anti-Memetics Division, and a single member of the O5 Council, this is just your average run-of-the-mill video. This is a private conversation between you and the Foundation, SCP-3393. We hope you don't mind the designation. It's not like we know your real name, but we can make some rather educated guesses. We actually know very little about you on the whole, a fact we hope to change in the future. Much like several other anomalies we have files on, such as SCP-055, the Self-Keeping Secret, and SCP-2256, the Very Tall Things, information recorded about you isn't exactly sustainable. It becomes forgotten or unreadable shortly after it's noted down. It's a clever anomalous ability, and one we've only been able to counteract with the application of powerful amnestic drugs. But clearly that isn't the only thing you have going for you. How do you think you've been able to access all of these videos, filled with classified information about anomalies, groups of interest, and even the inner workings of the Foundation itself? Through methods currently unknown to us, you've been able to somehow give your account level 4 clearance, giving you free reign over almost every file available. As much as it shames us to admit it, we haven't been able to remove this unpermitted clearance from your account, or even locate it for that matter. Like we've said before, you're a very clever anomaly. We respect that about you, even though you've been using this apparently crafty sapiens to inconvenience us. Our best guess is that you owe much of your success to powerful anti-memetic properties inherent to your anomalous being. But if we're off the mark on that, do feel free to enlighten us. Speaking of guesses, let's get back to what we think we know about you. After all, that's why you're really here, isn't it? No point being bashful, SCP-3393. You may be good at hiding yourself, but your intentions are plain as day. You don't need to be a senior researcher here to intuit that much about you. The following are all facts we believe we know about you with 90% confidence. You'll have to let us know how close we were in the end. Assumption number 1. You are a corporeal entity. That's right. You probably wanted us to assume that you were some kind of digital ghost, didn't you? Some mysterious, ethereal thought form existing only in the realm of cyberspace while you sneak around Site-31 making mischief. We're afraid that the ghost has been given up, so to speak. As clever as you are, it isn't quite as clever as you believe yourself to be. You've gotten sloppy at times, and in these moments you've given us a wealth of evidence. Don't you think the Foundation researchers and guards, people trained to notice even the most minute anomalous interference, wouldn't notice doors opening and closing on their own? Equipment moving, computer terminals activated despite no digital trace of approved Foundation login credentials. We must say we're a little insulted by how much you've underestimated us here. We know the files you've accessed. We know that you're aware of some of the monstrosities the Foundation deals with: ghosts, deadly viruses, reality warpers, some creatures that can shapeshift or become invisible, deadly memes for goodness sake. Did you really think our personnel would see the signs of your meddling and think, it was probably nothing? That's a rather dangerous oversight on your part. Assumption number 2. You're attracted to information about yourself. Don't try to deny this one, SCP-3393. The fact you're still watching this video is proof of your self-obsession, and you've left your digital fingerprints all over any other file that made the mistake of mentioning you. We have pages upon pages of logs showing your long record of unauthorized access, and the grand majority of the files you accessed were about you. Like we said, you're a vain little creature. That much is plain to see. This leads us nicely on to assumption number 3. You seek out this information about yourself in order to make changes to it, or even delete it entirely if it displeases you. We'll admit this one we find the most frustrating. It's one thing to access files without our permission, quite another to mess with our hard work. We get enough problems from Technical Director Rosen already without needing to constantly pester him about improving file security. The file about you has undergone a number of needless modifications and deletions. The following was a personal favorite. Quote, Object Class Euclid. Special Containment Procedures. Don't worry, I can handle this. Description. I wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to exist. At least not like this. But let me deal with it. This thing that I am is best kept away from all of you. Don't try to analyze me or test me or whatever. I don't want any of you to catch what I have. Just call me self-containing and we'll be good. End quote. We suppose you thought this one was pretty funny, right? You're clearly an intelligent creature, who or whatever you are, but the clear arrogance on display here doesn't suit you. While you may coast off of your anti-memetic properties, it is important to remember that you aren't untouchable. Speaking of which, assumption number 4. Your anti-memetic properties can be transferred. We found this to be a particular interesting wrinkle in your story. We know you've got a sense of humor, so you'll have to appreciate the irony in your attempts to alter or destroy information about yourself, telling us more about you than we ever knew before. Initially, when other files were reported missing, we thought you must have been deleting them out of spite. However, upon further examination, we found that the files were still very much there, and you were the last user to access them. This is perhaps the most dangerous thing about you, and we don't even know if you knew it until now. Your anti-memetic properties have a tendency to rub off and affect the things you interact with. With a power like that, you could compromise the whole database. And obviously, we can't allow that to happen. Assumption number 5. You have a strong resistance to memetic agents, much to our frustration. We know that they can affect you, of course, but your tolerance is far higher than that of the average human being. We needed to load this video with some of our very best just to make sure it would actually work. Your memetic resistance has even foiled certain prior containment attempts. So you've really been making us earn our keep, SCP-3393. Assumption number 6. You are confined to Site-31. This is another inconvenient truth for you, isn't it? First, we need to figure out you're a corporeal being, existing out here in space-time with the rest of us, and then we figure out exactly which space and time you're occupying. Can you feel the net tightening around you, 3393? Of course, we don't want you to be nervous. Just sit tight and enjoy the video. You're a very clever anomaly after all. Far too clever to be contained by the likes of us. You've been performing your operations right under the noses of Site-31's most talented personnel. All the phenomenon we've been attributing to you, from the open doors to the tampered computer terminals, have occurred exclusively in Site-31. And while we may not be able to track down your account and strip it of its phony clearances, did you know we can log which computer terminals unauthorized access to our files comes from? That's just basic cybersecurity, and we don't need to tell you that all of your unauthorized accesses have been logged to Site-31 terminals. Very sloppy, 3393. Or should we call you Dr. Mackey? Forgive us if that isn't your name. We hate to jump to conclusions here at the Foundation, but we couldn't help but notice that your anomalous activity began shortly after a researcher named Dr. Mackey disappeared from Site-31. Interestingly, much like you, Dr. Mackey isn't remembered by anyone else on the site. We only know Dr. Mackey worked here from records we discovered not too long ago. We know that Dr. Mackey was conducting experiments here, though data on the particulars of those experiments have been destroyed by you, we presume. We also presume that you were most likely either Dr. Mackey or the product of one of Dr. Mackey's experiments. We've made a few attempts to nab you already, but you've always slipped through the cracks. Like the sweep of Site-31 where we sent in MTF-810 See No Evil. our team that specializes in combating visual cognito hazards. Those guys are tough cookies, and they're damn good at their job, so it is a mystery how you evaded them. Our current best guess is that you were hiding in some undocumented location within the site. Our attempts at memetic incapacitation were equally unsuccessful. As we mentioned before, it's clear that you have a greater resilience to memetic agents than any of your non-anomalous counterparts. We estimate that even a kill agent would probably do little more than weaken you. That is impressive, we'll give you that. Our estimation for why you've been able to so handedly thwart our attempts at containing you is that your access to the system has also given you access to all of our plans. You know exactly what's going on before we even execute the attempt, giving you time to think up and execute an effective countermeasure. But we here at the Foundation believe that knowledge is power, SCP-3393, and we have more than enough to finally contain you. Don't panic, it's already essentially over, but we'll do you the courtesy of explaining how we got you in the end. Welcome to Operation Bait the Hook. We know you're within Site-31, and we know you're attracted to information about yourself. So we limited the scope of where this handy little video could be viewed to 5 terminals in the site. We put measures in place to notify us whenever the file was accessed, and from which terminal, at which point MTF 8-10 would be dispatched to seal off all available exits and quarantine the room around the terminal, a process that would only take several minutes. Just enough time for a vain little creature to watch a video about itself, as it's forever entombed within the telltale terminal that finally gave it away. You wouldn't be brought into a containment chamber, so we simply brought the containment chamber to you. As the network connections for this particular terminal are shut off, we can safely say you won't be causing us problems anymore. You're a very clever anomaly, SCP-3393, just not quite as clever as us.
A woman walks through the lonely hills in the dead of night. Her purple sari is torn and filthy from days of exposure to the elements. Her bare feet have been cut up and bruised by the rough terrain she walks. But her clothes and feet are not the most noticeable thing about her. This woman is pregnant, her belly swollen to freakish proportions. It's frankly a miracle that she's even able to walk in this state. She stumbles and sways under the weight of the thing growing inside her. Whatever it is, it's too large to be any kind of ordinary baby. But she keeps moving, muttering to herself in a language that no human ear has heard in years. Her eyes are glazed over, almost hypnotized. She moves with great purpose, but her vacant facial expression makes it appear as though she doesn't know exactly what that purpose is. She just needs to keep moving further into the wilderness until it happens, whatever it is. The one thing that's certain is that it isn't anything good. A car rumbles down a nearby dirt road. It's being driven by Dr. Vinay Ramachandran, a medical practitioner from the nearby city of Surat, who occasionally drives out to the more rural areas where the locals might not have easy access to medical help. He spots the staggering woman and immediately pumps the brakes of his car. She's clearly in need of medical attention. Thank goodness he happened to be driving by at the time. Dr. Ramachandran grabs his medical bag from the back seat and rushes towards the woman, who collapses in a heap before he reaches her. That's when, to his utter horror, Dr. Ramachandran notices that the woman's belly is continuing to swell at an unnatural rate. Even for a woman who is heavily pregnant with triplets, this would still be far too large, and the rate at which she's swelling is akin to someone blowing up a balloon. By the time Dr. Ramachandran reaches her, the worst has already happened. The woman's belly has burst open, and crouching on her corpse is the thing that was growing inside her. An adult man, nude and covered in blood. Dr. Ramachandran's terror only increases when he notices that the man is eating her. Elsewhere, a riot is unfolding in the streets. A megaphone-wielding instigator barks orders for violence and chaos as the rioters spread, setting fires, smashing windows, and attacking any unfortunate civilians caught in their way. It's one of the worst riots that the area has ever seen. Even the veteran riot cops are frightened by the ferocity of it. The cops descend and clash with the crowd of ever-advancing rioters. They're beaten back with crowbars, baseball bats, knives, and metal pipes. And behind them all, the instigator continues spitting his venomous words, working the crowd into an unmatchable frenzy. They'll need heavy reinforcements if they want to get this riot under control. That's when one of the riot cops on the front line, Sergeant Abhishek, notices something strange. So many of the rioters seem to have the exact same face, the face of the instigator. Another place, another time, 4 men are digging up a grave in a desolate old graveyard. They work tirelessly, all moving in perfect synchronicity. They're only interrupted when a group of heavily armed men crash the party and start firing on them. But these grave robbers are prepared. All of them draw revolvers like a gang in an old western and begin returning fire, causing the men in tactical gear to seek cover behind the nearby tombstones. While one of the grave robbers continues to fire, the other 3 scatter during the confusion. When his gun runs dry with that telltale click, the men in tactical gear immediately rise up and pincushion him with shot after shot of their assault rifles. He does the bullet dance like Tony Montana and collapses to the ground. But when the gunmen approach to confirm the kill, there's a horrifying twist of fate. Swarms of horrible red flies start pouring out of every bullet wound, swarming the attackers, who retreat, swatting away these horrible little insects. But there's so many of them, there's no way to stop at least some of them from crawling into their mouths. Here's an interesting fact. All of these nightmarish incidents are connected. In the year 1969, a mysterious man was arrested in Himatnagar, an area in the Indian state of Gujarat. This man had been accused of inciting civil unrest, terrorizing and distressing the local people. He was later extradited to an unknown location after the Indian authorities received a request from a mysterious organization known as, yep, you guessed it, the SCP Foundation. Who could this man have possibly been to attract such attention? The authorities thought it best not to question it. They were probably just glad to be rid of the troublemaker once and for all. Except they weren't, not by a long shot. A few years later, in 1975, a group of 4 men were discovered in a cemetery, this time in Ahmedabad, another location in Gujarat, India, for desecrating graves. This would be strange and upsetting enough, but what really sent things to the next level of weirdness was the discovery that these 4 men were all the same man. Each one was not only genetically identical to one another, but also to the man that had been extradited in 1969. You'd be more than justified in asking, what the hell is going on here? Maybe they were just a group of highly rare quintuplets, 5 children all born from the same mother, who just happened to have a predilection towards crime and antisocial behavior. Or perhaps something stranger was afoot. The 4 who appeared in the cemetery might have been clones of the original troublemaker in Himnatnagar. As relatively simple as those explanations would be, the truth was in fact far, far weirder than mad science or coincidentally criminal quintuplets. The 4 from the cemetery had been ambushed by operatives of the Global Occult Coalition, another shadowy organization fans of this channel are likely to recognize. The Coalition, or GOC, is a group that views itself as the police of the paranormal world, using extremely advanced technology to destroy supernatural entities and artifacts rather than contain them. They've been known to work both alongside and against the SCP Foundation. Both groups' combined interest in 4 genetically identical men in an Indian graveyard seemed to suggest there was something supernatural about their origin. One of the men had been killed by the GOC, while the remaining 3 were taken into custody by the SCP Foundation. Gotta love the power of teamwork. But who were these men? Where had they come from? And why did they share identical genes to the first man from 6 years earlier? Could there have been even more of them? Well, in the years following, the Foundation has been able to determine that, yes, there are more of these genetically identical individuals out there. Across the more rural states of India, like Gujarat, Rajasthan, Himachal Pradesh, Haryana, Punjab, Jammu, and Kashmir, there may be over 1,000 instances of the same person. Collectively, they are known as SCP-2833. While their outward appearance can vary somewhat, instances of SCP-2833 all share the exact same genetic traits as each other. Depending on the area they are located in, these anomalous people can speak various languages and regional dialects, including Hindi, English, Gujarati, Dogiri, Kashmiri, Punjabi, Urdu, and even an outdated unknown language that doesn't correspond with any known modern dialect or language family. Each SCP-2833 also possesses the ability to manipulate the organic matter of their own body. Now, we don't mean that these men will stretch themselves like Mr. Fantastic, or turn into something out of John Carpenter's The Thing, but they're able to use their bodies to create, well, something. SCP-2833 instances can produce a small anomalous parasite known as SCP-2833-A. These are often released through any bodily orifice like the mouth, nose, or ears, or through any cuts or open wounds suffered by an SCP-2833. In other words, if you shot and killed an SCP-2833, perhaps in a cemetery under the orders of the Global Occult Coalition, then these parasites would still be able to escape through the victim's bullet wounds. The only way to stop this from happening is to incinerate the body of a deceased SCP-2833, burning them until there is nothing left. So what exactly are these parasites? Well, they're tiny invertebrates, meaning they're a small, cold-blooded organism with no spine that can live on land or in water. They closely resemble dipterians, which are any order of insects that contain what we know as flies. Red in color and 20 millimeters in length, SCP-2833-A's are composed of a combination of muscle tissue, keratin, the protein that your hair, skin, and fingernails are made from, and traces of ash, strangely enough. They are also capable of flying with their 2 wings, and will use these to attempt to enter the body of a suitable host. While this can be any vertebrate creature, it seems they have a preference for humans. Once inside the host's body, an SCP-2833-A parasite will attach itself to their nervous system. This then allows the SCP-2833 instance that the parasite originated from to control the body of the host, taking over their bodily and motor functions, nervous system, and all of their sensory organs. From here, an SCP-2833 will then either subject the target to vivid, inescapable hallucinations or manipulate the functions of their body. The parasites also contain a miniature instance of another SCP-2833, only about 2 millimeters long. While these mini SCP-2833s are usually chemically inactive, lying dormant and unable to move, this changes if the parasite's host is a human female. In these cases, the SCP-2833-A creature will implant the miniature SCP-2833 within the uterus of their female host. After this, the new SCP-2833 will begin to rapidly grow, consuming any and all organic matter that surrounds it. Once again, the SCP-2833 that the parasite originated from is still able to manipulate the female host's body, and will use this control to make her leave her home and travel away from any urban environment. After a year, this new instance of SCP-2833 will be born in a truly horrific fashion. Every time this happens, the female host is unable to survive the process, dying as a result of being used as an incubator for the parasites. The newly formed SCP-2833 will retain all memories of the previous instance that released the parasite. They are even able to speak fluently from the moment they are born, but that isn't the most horrific part. What happens next is that the newborn SCP-2833 will then devour the body of the female host that carried it. Sometimes the host can die before an SCP-2833 is born, with the parasite keeping their body embalmed until the new instance emerges. But regardless, the mother of an SCP-2833 will always die during birth. The SCP Foundation has conducted a number of interviews with the instances of SCP-2833 that they have captured and detained. The first, SCP-2833-1, the man causing civil unrest in Himnatargar, 1969, referred to himself as we, implying that all of the SCP-2833 instances share the same consciousness, acting as a hive mind of sorts. One of the men from the cemetery, SCP-2833-4, elaborated further on the nature of these anomalous beings when asked how many of the instances existed.
We are in your cages. We are distant from the hordes of the ignorant. We are grown like crops and livestock. We are growing in numbers and faith, and we will grow until the ascension of Samadhi. Samadhi is beyond sight. The buried will rise, to be consumed as the doorway to rebirth. This is our cycle. Waiting for Samadhi with patience, we shall dance the Tandava and consume the world for its rebirth.
Samadhi is a word meaning a crypt, usually the final resting place of a saint or someone of religious significance. Additionally, the Tandava is an ancient dance that, according to legends, was performed by the Hindu god Shiva, who is believed to be the source of all things, the cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction. So these anomalous beings and their parasites appeared to be awaiting the discovery of an ancient burial site, where someone or something was prophesied to rise, consume the world, and then recreate it. Thinking this Samedi might pose a threat, the Foundation probed a later instance of SCP-2833 for further information on its significance.
If you intend to seek Samedi, your quest is in vain, for we are the inheritor to Samedi. Only we.
SCP-2833-42 protested when asked about the Samedi by a Foundation researcher, one Dr. Sanjay Sheel.
Samedi does not threaten. It is we who were threatened, exiled when the Colossi overran Samedi. We are the remnants, but we are never defeated.
The instance went on.
We are of glorious lineage, the chosen stock of Karsis Vaski. Only the strongest and most zealous may serve his purpose. To that end, we consume ourselves to persist and await for Samedi.
When asked who exactly Karsis Vaski was, SCP-2833-42 answered,
We are Karsis Vaski.
That word, Karcist, has long been associated with the religious cult of Sarkicism, another group of interests you're likely to be familiar with if you're a fan of what we do here. This group worships flesh and disease and is seen as an apocalyptic threat by the SCP Foundation. The Sarkis religion was founded thousands of years ago by an ancient elder being known as the Sorcerer King of Aditum, also called Grand Karcist Ion. The goal of Sarkicism is to bring about a new age of flesh, elevating humanity to the form of gods and potentially terraforming the entire Earth using SCP-610, the flesh that hates. So who or what was Karsis Vaski? What role did it have in the religion of Sarkicism, and how does it link to SCP-2833? The Foundation has collected a number of documents once belonging to a man named Sir William Henry Sleeman. Sleeman was an administrator who worked in India on behalf of the British East India Company before his death in 1856, and it is in his documents that some of the answers can be found. According to Sir William, the poor of India told him about a group of mystics who were both revered and feared among the country's peasantry. This group called themselves the Vatula and seemed to hold what Sleeman described as an unusual fetish towards death and decay. Sounds an awful lot like the Sarkists, doesn't it? Sir William heard rumors that these Vatula worshipped Shiva, but were never seen at temples, choosing instead to worship the Hindu god in seclusion. Additionally, though, each member of the Vatula, when asked, identified themselves by the title of Karsis Vaski. Not everyone feared them, however, as a group of men would often attack them. These men were Thuggee, organized gangs of professional robbers and murderers that traveled India, strangling their victims to death and robbing them blind. Perhaps because of this, the Vatula seemed wary to interact with any other worshippers of Shiva, often dismissing them as pretenders to the faith. Hoping to appease and gain an audience with the Vatula, Sir William's allies unleashed what they called the Daughter of Shadows, better known as SCP-029. This divided the Thuggee in the hopes that the Vatula would then accept Sleeman as an ally. Eventually, he achieved an audience with them and was unable to determine whether the group was genuinely devoted to their religious beliefs or was just a group of madmen. What Sir William didn't realize was that under the vestige of Karsis Vaski, this group was subtly spreading the influence of Sarkicism over India. As for SCP-2833, perhaps they are the descendants of the Vatula group, their lineage continuing through the passing of those little parasites. It's highly likely that these Vatula were all early instances of SCP-2833, which would explain why those captured by the SCP Foundation claim that they are all Karsis Vaski. A few years back in 2014, one of the Foundation's mobile task forces uncovered a body that was a genetic match to the other instances of SCP-2833. However, this one wasn't found in India, but in Krasnoyarsk, Russia. It had strange growths on its muscle tissue and bones, carrying multiple SCP-2833-A parasites inside its internal organs. The body had even been modified to contain an artificial uterus, which carried an infant SCP-2833 instance. It seemed that not only have SCP-2833 found a new way to evolve, carrying themselves in a modified body, but they're also beginning to spread further than ever before. You gotta hand it to the Sarkists. They're certainly adaptable. What is your favorite word? Think about it for a moment. Think real hard. Write it down in the comments, posted for everyone else to see. How many letters does it have? How many syllables? Say it aloud. How does it sound? How does it feel on your tongue? Really, really think about it.
Now make sure you keep that word in mind. It's important, and we'll come back to it later. For now, it's time to talk about SCP-3449. Look, there's really nothing any special about this one. It wasn't even important enough to be mentioned with the other info hazards. It's not an evil talking toaster, that's for sure. SCP-3449 appears to just be a standard spiral notebook. Notebook? It's supposed to be notebook, right? Anyway, it's just a standard spiral notebook with a dark blue cover. It's safe class, and it's stored in the standard containment locker in Site-19. There aren't any other containment requires, but testing is currently underway to determine, I think it's meant to be determine, long-term containment requirements.
This is a mess.
Anyway, this item and its anomalous power is actually considered so inconsequential that researchers have explored the possibility of putting it on the anomalous items log, a place where items too useless to warrant a full file ends up. Jeez, how do you misspell up that badly? It's 2 letters. Well, it's supposed to be 2 letters. How did you work Z into that? They aren't even close to each other on keyboard.
Man.
Anyway, the notebook contains mostly blank pages. Some are torn and only 6 contain actual writing. But due to the formatting of the writing, the text, consisting mainly of diary entries, is almost unreadable. This is due to syntaxical errors, random capitalization, and rampant misspellings? Great, you misspelled misspellings. How cute. Apparently, all attempts to correct these misspellings fail, or even lead to additional misspellings. This anomalous effect extends to anyone attempting to write— Yep, that was spelled R-I-G-H-T. Anyone attempting to write about SCP-3449, including the script for this video, apparently. There are no further notable anomalous properties. Tests are ongoing, though those with any inquiries about testing SCP-3449 should contact lead researcher Nicolo Gurdnell. The notebook, which was misspelled even worse this time, impressive, was first recovered by MTF-6, also known as the Village Idiots, after a series of info-hazardous and cognito-hazardous phenomenon were discovered in the Pittsburgh metro area. The source seemed to be a storage unit filled with anomalous items, and SCP-3449 was amogus. I think that's meant to be among them. The storage unit was registered to a man by the name of Edward Salisbury, currently designated as Porpoise of Interest 4335. Whew, that's the end of that. Thanks for watching the video, folks. Now go check out— oh, wait, there's more. Phenomenal. Let's keep going. Apparently, that version of the file was an older one. Let's check the next one and see if that's any more useful. Oh my. It appears that the updates here are actually quite extensive. Okay, let's give this another try. SCP-3449 is a Euclid-class SPC kept in the humanid containment cells of Site-19. Items affected by it are kept in standard storage lockers for safe-class anomalous objects at the same site. The primary reason for this shift is that SCP-3449 has changed its object of designation. It is no longer the spiral notebook. It is now a 34-year-old Caucasian man known as Edward Salisbury, formerly known as Person of Interest 4335. He is believed to be the creator of the notebook, as well as other objects found in the storage locker in Pittsburgh. Foundation personnel are now trying to locate and contain any other objects created by Mr. Salisbury, though success has been limited on this front. That was cute. SCP-3449's analogous abilities manifest onto both Edward himself and all the objects created by him. Reading about him or any of these objects will result in syntactical errors, arbitrary capitalizations, and rampart misspellings. Attempts to revise or correct the writing will either fail to remove the errors or create new errors. It appears that the anomalous effects of SCP-3449 proper are more severe than that of the ones caused by his anomalous objects. MTF-6, also known as the Village Idiots, apprehended SCP-3449 in his apartment just outside of Pittsburgh. He appeared to be in an advanced state of disorientation and dehydration. Records collected by the Mobile Task Force found that Mr. Selberg had not left his apartment in over 10 days. which would account for his dire health conditions. Salzberg did not communicate with Mambas of the Mobile Task Force, but did not reset, arrest, and subsequent containment either. Okay, these spellings are rough, but I'm going to try and power through. I am a professional, and we're almost there. The following is the full log of items obtained from SCP-3449's storage look car that also exhibit his anomalous effects. The notebook, as already discussed, the pages are either blank, torn, or illegible. Salzberg's computer. Files saved on this device include spreadsheets dealing personal finances, ideals for products, and an unfinished horror novel that is almost unreadable due to the poor quality of its writing. Grocery list had only 2 written items. Butter was spelled with only 1 T, and medication, which was spelled medication. A planner. Last entry was dated 2 weeks before containment and believed to contain reminders to perform various chores. However, a mixture of poor handwriting and word choice allows for other interpretations. And finally, Mr. Salzberg's cell phone. Foundation researchers were also able to collect the call logs in hopes of further tracking Salzberg's pre-containment activities. The last 3 calls, which were all made on the same day 2 weeks before containment, dialed different numbers, only one of which was in use. The Foundation made contact with the receiver of said call, who had no knowledge of SCP-3449, and claimed that they did not answer the call. Lead researcher Nicolo Gurdinel conducted the first interview with SCP-3449 shortly after his capture. When he entered the interview chamber, he found that SCP-3449 was just sitting in the corner, with his head in his hands, rocking back and forth in what appeared to be apparent distress. He then began looking down into his lap and twiddling his thumbs like a child. Nicolo engaged him in a calm and polite tone, addressing him as SCP-3449. The anomaly made eye contact with Dr. Gurdinel, but he didn't respond, and instead continued staring at him. As Gurdinel asked further questions, Salzberg simply didn't answer, or would, at the very most, acknowledge the questions with simple gestures. Gurdinel asked whether Salzberg was making products for his business, to which he smiled and shook his head. Gurdinel then asked Salzberg whether he could speak or not, or if it was merely a choose on his part. Unsurprisingly, Salzberg offered no explanation, and the interview came to a close shortly afterwards. Tests are still ongoing to find out if Salzberg's inability to speak or communicate come as a result of his anomalous traits, or if this is simply a result of apophonia, an uncommon but non-anomalous condition that renders its victims unable to speak. Tests have confirmed that Salzberg does have all the organs required for vocalization, but appears to not use them. Further tests are required. Alright, there we have it. That was a complete nightmare to read thanks to SCP-3449's anomalous effects, but at least it's over now. Now, go check out... Wait, there's more. Another update to the file. Good, okay. Alright, let's go take a look. Oh, I see. This is a lot more dangerous than I thought. I suppose I better read on. SCP-3449 has been upgraded to Keter Class Anomal. SCP-3449-A, the new designation for Edward Salzberger, is to be kept in a high-security hazmat containment in Site-19. The inanimate anomalous possessions of Edward Salzberg are to be kept in standard object containment. Any reports written on SCP-3449 must be rotten by people who have been exposed to it for less than 7 days in order to keep the files rateable. To prevent this infectious info-hazmat from spread further, the number of people allowed to interact with this anomaly is kept relatively small and consists of those that have already been exposed at some point or another. This includes O5-8, MTF-6, Dr. Teller's research team, some additional personnel selected for XPC-3449 research, and personnel chosen to update SCP-3449 documentation. Some additional personnel selected for XPC-3449 research and personnel chosen to update SCP-3449 documentation. While Edward Salzberg and his personal effects are chronically locked up, SCP-3449 is not currently considered contained. Research into the spread of SCP-3449's effects, the vectors for transmission, and any potential remedies for its degenerative effects are now top priority for all involved before this whole thing gets out of hand. Further research has taught the Foundation that not only are Salzberg and his items powerful info hazards, their anomalous effects appear to be able to infect these who experience them permanently. Initially, it will appear that writing quality only degrades when the subject is actually writing about SCP-3449 itself, but over time they'll come to the frightening realization that it actually affects their writing as a whole. The effect also progresses in its severity over time, eventually rendering the victim's ability to write legible sentences completely destroyed. The initial anomalous effects of SCP-3449 were discovered when MTF-6 write their field reports on the matter and found it littered with syntactical error, random capitalization, and rampant impellings. Similar errors appearing in the initial fail about SCP-3449 only serve to reaffirm this observation. However, researchers only began to notice true extent of SCP-3449's effects when the Village Idiot's field reports concerning other Solomines came in with equally atrocious writing. Attempts to correct this writing simply led to more mistakes and frustration on part of team. Soon after, a researcher named Dr. Teller, who'd since taken over the SCP-3449 case, and his team found that they were experiencing similar issues. They couldn't just make the blurs happen, no matter how hard they concentrated. They forgot spellings. They couldn't make hand move in the manner they waited to in order to form the words. Even the most intelligent and articulate members of the team came across as extremely young children on page, but didn't stop there. Wasn't long before researchers who'd never worked on the SCP-3449 case started to exhibit these same suspicious errors in own writing. The Foundation didn't know how, but this slickness was starting to spread, with people's abilities to write degrading across the entire Foundation. That's when a Foundation web trawler picked up something even more disturbing. Global literacy seemed to be taking a dive. The telltale syntactical error, random to capitalization, and rampant misspellings ticking up everywhere and for everyone. And the end of writing would be one thing, but SCP-3449 doesn't stop there. No, that's just the beginning. Morse code go next, then pictograms, not long for sign language become hopeless scrambled. Communication breaks down little by little. People can't draw anymore, can't move right hands. Call goes, calls, codes, last go, his voice. Talking gets hard. Remember favorite word? Think about it, say it loud. When SCP-3449 done, when everyone infected, you'll never say again. Nobody will ever say again.
Call them what you will, be it myths, urban legends, ghost stories, or just fool yarns. The fact is, we've all heard at least one. Traditionally, stories like that were just shared around a campfire, but nowadays they have ended up spreading far and wide across internet message boards and creepy threads. Everything ranging from unsolved missing persons cases actually being the result of alien abductions, to haunted videos carrying an unforgiving curse, or some missing unaired episode of popular TV shows that had somehow been unearthed by an online sleuth. We're always quick to share these ideas, these stories, but deep down a part of us knows that there's no truth to them. Urban myths are speculation that someone has turned into a tale of terror, for nothing more than to give some quick scares to whoever they tell it to. But then that person passes that tale on to someone else, and suddenly, the story had become a widespread legend with no discernible point of origin. Sure, they might still be fictional, but through sharing these stories, we as humans bring them to life. Not literally, of course, that would be outlandish. After all, when was the last time you heard of a fictional story becoming reality? Growing up with exposure and unfiltered access to the internet in the late 2000s, Paul Jacobs and his friends had been fascinated with, and admittedly pretty terrified by, the notorious legend of the Slender Man. It began as whisperings in an online forum, a story that was intentionally designed to be a modern-day urban myth. And just like so many others before it, the myth spread. What had started as a forum post became unnerving photoshopped images of a tall, faceless figure in a suit lurking in the woods, next an indie video game, and even a real-world tragedy. Given how young he was at the time, still being in high school, Paul and a few others had bought into the Slender Man myth wholesale. He believed it to be real, this towering, expressionless boogeyman. The more he learned about this malevolent creature, every story, blog post, or creepy YouTube video made about Slender Man only added more and more to his legend and kept young Paul awake at night, afraid that every noise outside his bedroom window was the faceless horror. Of course, if you take away that belief, the possibility an urban legend might be true, then it simply loses its power. It's that potential, that maybe, towing the line between fantasy and reality, that can allow these stories to go on and incite fear forever. But that wasn't the case for the Slenderman story, and the craze for it quickly died down after it was debunked numerous times over, casting it permanently back into the realm of fiction. But the profound effect the legend had on Paul at a young age ended up informing his future. As he grew older, his past fear of certain stories became a keen interest in how these tales could influence people. Could any story have that same impact? Or only those that walked the line between fictional and maybe being true? Did these urban legends become more real to people because of their subject matter? Or did human beings give them that power to transcend the constraints of fiction just by believing in them? As Paul got older, he began to study the truth behind certain urban legends, attempting to trace them back to their origins. Some were often inspired by real events, but with specific details that had gradually been altered from the original story the more and more people passed it around. Ghost stories seemed to be the most changeable, but with some roots in the real world. A person might have died 100 years ago, and the story of them haunting their old home or final resting place would start to circulate. Then, shortly after, another similar story might emerge, and the two would overlap. Whoever was telling each story might have added or omitted certain details or combined elements of more than one tale, until what was left being passed around was neither the first story nor the second, but a hybrid of different versions from different storytellers. There was one legend that Paul felt drawn to more than others, and it was a rather obscure one to say the least. During his self-conducted research into stories of this nature, he learned about a tale that told of an ancient sect called the Davites. According to legends, some that dated so far back that they preceded almost all of recorded history, these Davites were a callous and cruel civilization. They had emerged from a book, so the story went, and sought only to wage war on other cultures and enslave their enemies. But Paul also uncovered one detail of the story that intrigued him more than any other. It referred to something known as the Eternal Text, and was regarded as some kind of deity or figure of worship by the Davites. The legend stated that this text had helped create the book that they had emerged from. Of course, this all sounded like highly fictitious nonsense to Paul Jacobs. He knew that things of such nature didn't exist in the real world. They were only part of stories. But he had noticed that this particular story seemed to have passed its way through the ages. Searching further, Paul had uncovered the works of an obscure author from the United States who had only a few works that were known about during the 1940s and 50s. Even then, most of his stories weren't widely published, only a few shorter pieces making it into a magazine that had long since stopped being printed. This writer had died in 1957, having never seen his career in fiction come to fruition. But despite his short-lived career and being considered a somewhat subpar author at the time, the writer's work had garnered its own little cult following online, mostly comprised of amateur authors. It was through them that Paul managed to obtain some scanned copies of the anonymous writer's stories, particularly some that he felt bore a striking similarity to the Daevite legends of the Eternal Text. One story in particular, written in a style lifted directly from H.P. Lovecraft, was based on a supposed encounter the writer claimed to have had with something that closely resembled the Eternal Text. Paul also studied the writer's own personal journals that he had managed to recover scans of. The entries from it seemed to imply that the author came across what he called the written God, and that this compelled him to write a fictional version of those events. It was only after writing about this new encounter that what he had depicted in his stories seemed to come true, exactly as he'd written them. This led to a recursive process of the writer creating these encounters only for them to occur, thus causing him to write about it and then make it happen. The entire prospect not only confused and bewildered Paul, but intrigued him further as well. Although he had no way of confirming what this writer had claimed was true, Paul believed that on a smaller scale, the author had achieved the same effect that occurs during the passing down of urban legends, but the difference here was that it had all been done through himself, via a singular person telling variations on the same story, allowing it to continue and perpetrate recursively. Of course, Paul didn't actually believe in this written God or eternal text. Those were all just part of the fiction, but he wanted to experiment further and see if he could achieve the same process for himself. Taking an empty notebook, Paul started to write the first things that came to mind, basing a short story off of the anonymous author's own tale. He intentionally changed a few key details, noting down things that weren't in the original. "The written God appeared behind me," he wrote, adding on a whim the line, "It had no face." The whole intention of Paul's experiment was to pass his new version of the story on to someone else, and then try to get them to write it from memory. He wanted to observe if their mind would change certain details subconsciously, or if they would misremember elements when they retold their new version. If enough people could spread the story around, each time altering or adding new parts to it, what effect could it have? As he finished his rewritten version of the author's tale, attaching it to an email to send to one of his fellow writers, Paul was blissfully unaware of just what he'd done. A heavy knocking rang out, somebody's fist pounding at the front door loud enough to wake him. Bleary-eyed, Paul checked the alarm clock next to his bed. It was the middle of the night. Stumbling out of bed, he staggered his way towards the repetitive noise, unsure who or what would be calling this late. Paul froze for a second, casting his mind back to the story he had written earlier. Surely not. It couldn't be right. It was just a story after all. But the author, he had described how the things he'd written had come true. There it was, that possibility that maybe, what if it was behind the door right now? Suddenly, something much heavier than a hand bashed against the wooden surface of the front door, causing it to fly open, the catch of the lock being ripped out of the wall by the force of the impact. A group of black-clad figures rushed in, one of them tackling Paul to the ground before he could even process what was happening. The weight of another person pinned him down and kept him from moving, despite his attempts at struggling free. Then the feeling of something sharp poked at the exposed skin of Paul's neck, a needle filled with, he wasn't sure. All he really knew right now was how dizzy he was. Unable to stop himself from slipping away, the sedative quickly put Paul back to sleep as the agents filed into his home. The floor he woke up on was freezing cold. Blinking his heavy eyelids until they opened again, Paul did his best to stand. His head was still spinning, making it hard to keep his feet still, and to make matters worse, the room around him was hardly lit. Only a few low fluorescents dimly illuminated the tiny space.
"Mr. Jacobs,"
a voice boomed over a crackly intercom, the pitch lowered to distort it further.
"we need you to answer a few questions for us."
"What?" Paul responded in confusion.
"Where did you first learn about SCP-582?
The voice questioned, barely giving Paul a moment to think.
"About what? What's an SCP?"
he asked back.
You wrote a story earlier today, correct?"
Boomed the unseen speaker. Meekly, Paul nodded his head.
"We monitor online activity for any mentions of SCP-582, or anything using any of its known aliases."
"You mean that written God eternal text thing?"
Paul replied, catching on to what the voice had been referring to.
"I read about it in some stories by this old author. He died ages ago. Most of his work is pretty niche. It's actually hard to track down."
"Enough!"
The voice interjected bluntly.
When did you specify SCP-582 would manifest?
Manifest? He raised an eyebrow, confused again. It was just a story, that's what I was doing. I was examining stories and how they change when they get passed on.
Mr. Jacobs.
It sounded as though the voice had shifted. Still distorted, but now calmer, more collected. Somebody else was speaking.
It is important you answer our questions. Your life could be very well in danger. Now, do you remember when you wrote that SCP-582, when it was going to appear?
What do you mean, in danger? Paul retorted in a panic. Who the heck even are you people?
Calm down, Mr. Jacobs.
He looked down to see his hands were trembling, suddenly aware of the sweat coating his forehead. Paul took a series of deep breaths, trying to collect himself. I don't remember, he sighed, his voice now shaking as much as the rest of him was.
What about a location?
The voice pressed him.
Can you tell us where it's going to appear?
I didn't write a location either, Paul answered. I just said it appeared. The words he had written earlier quickly came crashing back into his head, almost like an urgent warning. Behind me. As he spoke, Paul could sense someone standing near him. That same sensation you get when you know another person is in the room, even when you haven't looked directly at them yet. Paul tried to keep his head forward, only tilting it slightly to the side, seeing something dark looming just behind his shoulder. He couldn't rationalize any of what was happening. He was too scared to turn all the way around. Doing that would admitted all of this was real, and not just some horrific nightmare. Not just a story. For the first time, the voice over the intercom sounded uneasy.
We think you need to turn around, Mr. Jacobs.
Telling himself he'd wake up any second, Paul rotated with his eyes screwed shut, snapping them open once he was facing nothing. A blank space lacking any expression, and all of the normal features was looming over him with an empty, eyeless stare. It had no face, just like in Paul's story. He opened his mouth to let out a scream, only for it to be interrupted by the crunching sounds of neck bones twisting the wrong way. As Paul's lifeless body dropped back down to the cold floor, SCP-582 vanished just as quickly as it had arrived. The thing about some anomalies is you have to be very careful about how you talk about them. Not just because they could be listening in and might hear you, but because what you say about them might just have a nasty habit of coming true. That is the case with SCP-582, otherwise known as its rather apt nickname, a bundle of stories. What's so fitting about that title is its accuracy. That's all SCP-582 really is, stories. But therein lies its true power. This entity has a way of propagating and perpetrating itself, continuously adapting and spreading like a mutating virus. Except it doesn't pass from person to person as an illness. There are no symptoms. It transmits via stories. SCP-582 is a subject to a process of passive reality manipulation. It doesn't necessarily directly change the world around it, but can itself be changed by certain factors. What this means is anything said or written about this entity, even if pulled out of thin air, a fictional account of its deeds, all becomes real. Let's say, for example, you told a story about SCP-582 sneaking up behind a Foundation researcher when his back was turned. Telling that story would cause those exact events to be carried out in the real world. When SCP-582 manifests, it will do so in accordance with any details given in a fictional account about it. The same time, the same place on Earth, it would appear in the exact form that the tale specified. If any of those details were omitted or purposely left vague, then the entity would still be able to manifest, and would do so in a way that fits the rest of the narrative, appearing wherever and whenever it has an opportunity to. As far as the researchers at the SCP Foundation can tell, the actual abilities of SCP-582 are usually left vague when people write about it. One of the few consistencies is that the entity can disappear and reappear at will, to any place or time. Another is that no method of harming or even killing SCP-582 has ever worked, even if written down as fiction in order to be made fact. Any other details or abilities that someone assigns to the creature will, however, become a permanent addition to its growing myth, meaning it is able to perpetually increase its power the more people write about it. On the rare occasion multiple different writers' accounts of SCP-582 contradict each other, or don't fit into the entity's own canon, it can easily adapt to these contradictions. This usually results in conflicting information having no effect on the bundle of stories, or having so little impact that it is almost like they didn't happen at all. In short, if one author's story doesn't quite match up with another's, then the effect these additions have to SCP-582 and its ongoing story are lessened, so that they can all either logically occur or be negated completely. It is because of this adaptability, and that it has been described by multiple sources, that portrayals of SCP-582 tend to be generalized. This even extends down to its appearance. It's currently unknown what the entity's true form is, or if it even has one. However, the fact that it is usually depicted as a deity or god means that this bundle of stories has been known to manifest as one of several avatars. The most common of these appearances is that of a humanoid being, standing well over 6 feet tall. When manifesting as this particular form, SCP-582 is dressed in thickly layered robes made from burlap or hessian, complete with a hood. However, no face is visible underneath the creature's hood, and when presenting as this avatar, it is often described as carrying sacks of unknown contents, sometimes even appearing to bleed heavily. There have been a number of other incarnations of SCP-582, including a 6-legged form that is made out of pure molten tar and will attack any nearby human beings on sight. This avatar would normally appear as being fused with the first. In other instances, it has appeared as a plant, capable of producing both light and enough radiation to kill anyone in its radius within a few hours of exposure. Other times it has been a vaguely human-shaped shadow, and even has one form that exists within more than 3 dimensions. Due to this form existing on higher dimensions, this made it impossible to properly perceive it with the naked eye, and resulted in the deaths of anyone who even looked partially at it. Who knows? Maybe at some point it has even been described as a tall, slender figure in a dark suit, with pale skin and a face with its eyes, ears, nose, and mouth all missing. Actually, it's probably best that nobody writes it down. We don't want it becoming real now, do we? The question is, how can you hope to contain or even fight something that can be anything, anywhere, and have any strength that someone claims it has? Well, just to be on the safe side, the Foundation uses its own fictional narrative to keep the entity contained. It is their hope that, by describing it as powerless, it will turn the creature's own reality-altering properties against it, and actually cause SCP-582 to lose its abilities. What thoughts, if any, that flow through that alien mind are not mine to know. It remains silent and still within its chamber, entrenched in the persistence of its own memory. It remains, but only as a shade of what it was, its power spent, or at least come to rest. So remember, SCP-582 possesses no actual consciousness or free will. Anything it has ever said or done is because someone wrote that it would. And yes, we're only saying that because we don't want to write that it's broken free from containment and is currently standing behind you. If we did that, it might just come true.
The SCP Foundation is responsible for containing some of the most dangerous forces in the world. Without them, we'd be at the mercy of the Plague Doctor, walking through the world and killing with a touch. Anyone could be snapped up by SCP-106 and dragged to a painful death in his pocket dimension lair. There would be no one to stop SCP-682 from devouring all living things in sight, and no one to hold back the dreaded Scarlet King from breaching our world and destroying life as we know it. We owe them a lot for sure, and they've earned at least a thank you card and an edible arrangement. But containing the anomalies of the world comes at a pretty steep cost. They're essentially fighting a war against a whole host of world-ending entities, and when you're at war, there are bound to be casualties. For some people and creatures out there, the most terrifying monster isn't 096 just trying to swallow them whole for looking at its face, or 173 just waiting for them to turn their back so it can snap their neck. For the unfortunates that find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, the scariest monster in the world is the SCP Foundation itself. A decade ago, the SCP Foundation was attempting to recapture SCP-682, which had breached containment and was tearing its way through the southern Congo region. Unable to contain the monster by other means, and desperate to stop it from killing any more civilians, the Foundation decided to implement some rather extreme measures. They deployed a variety of chemical agents and poisonous gases in an attempt to slow the creature down, but they had no effect. As the enormous reptile stomped its way toward a nearby river, with a highly populated village waiting on the other side, the Foundation made the decision to take things up a notch. They launched an aerial strike, deploying several aircrafts to drop explosives on the area around the river. They destroyed large portions of the riverbank, but the environmental impact was considered to be a necessary evil. When the smoke finally cleared and the deafening roars of the beast had gone quiet, they stopped their bombing campaign and dispatched Foundation operatives to the scene. There they found the bones of SCP-682, which were quickly brought into custody before the creature could begin to heal itself. The mission was considered a success, and they were ready to pull out all of their staff and head back to the nearest Foundation site, when one officer spotted something floating in the nearby river. It looked like a group of human corpses face down in the water, their bodies badly burned. Concerned that civilians from a nearby village had been inadvertently present for the bombing campaign, a team of officers was sent to investigate the river more closely. What they found was not a group of dead humans, but something else entirely. They were, all along the riverbank and floating in the water, approximately 212 specimens of a previously unknown humanoid species. The bodies were clustered in groups of 3 to 5, appearing to belong to the same family unit or social group. Many of them were frozen in positions of fear or attempt to defend themselves, with some observing personnel comparing them to the victims of the Pompeii eruption, stuck in their final terrified moments. What appeared to be parents and children held on to each other. Some covered their faces, others lay in a fetal position. It seemed that they had known something was coming to kill them, but they did not have the time or the understanding necessary to escape it. Several of the bodies were removed from the river for autopsy and examination in order to understand more about this new, possibly already extinct species. They were humanoid organisms with an indeterminable genus and species. They resembled tall, thin humans with absolutely no body hair and elongated limbs. The most unusual aspect of the creatures was in their mouths. Their teeth were serrated and sharp, resembling those of a crocodile. In spite of these monstrous teeth, an autopsy revealed that there was no human flesh present in any of the creatures' stomachs, instead suggesting a diet of fish, livestock, and whatever else they could peacefully scavenge. Every last corpse was removed from the area and incinerated, to prevent any civilians from coming across them and asking questions. Just when the Foundation personnel were finally packing up and getting ready to leave the river once and for all, they heard something. It was a mournful sound, something between a man bellowing and a wild animal yelping in pain. Something nearby was still very much alive, and it was screaming. The officers followed the sound and spotted one surviving specimen of the crocodile people lying along the bank of the river. It was holding its face in its hands, curled up into a ball near the water, and it was wailing in agony. There were no visible injuries on the creature's body, but it was clearly extremely distressed. One officer attempted to approach the creature, calling out to it that he meant no harm and wanted to get it some medical attention. It looked up at the officer with wide eyes, and its cries went quiet. The officer grabbed his weapon, afraid that the creature might suddenly rush him, but instead it ran into the river. It jumped into the water, plunging beneath the surface, and began thrashing around. After a moment of watching it struggle, the officer realized what was happening. The creature was trying to drown itself. He abandoned protocol completely at that moment, diving into the water and pulling the struggling creature back to shore. It coughed up water for several minutes, all the while trying to crawl back into the water. When the creature had finally calmed down, it was brought into Foundation custody with no further resistance. It appeared to be the last living member of whatever strange human-crocodile hybrid species was living in that river, and it was designated SCP-6415. Since it was brought into Foundation custody, SCP-6415's behavior has been largely very consistent. Some SCPs are constantly attempting to escape from their containment or killing an endless revolving door of D-Class personnel. But 6415 is not one of those anomalies. It is not aggressive in spite of its crocodilian characteristics, and it's content to eat the food provided by the Foundation. It is fed a diet of raw meat, mostly beef and goat, which is provided fresh daily. The Foundation was curious to see if the creature could be pushed to be aggressive if its circumstances were made a little less comfortable. They deprived it of food for several days, but it did not seem to notice or even care much aside from occasionally looking at the door to see if new food had come. They tried sleep deprivation next, blaring a loud siren sound over the speakers in the containment chamber anytime the creature was observed lying down or closing its eyes. It became listless and visibly exhausted, but did not act out violently at this either. After this testing, its ordinary feeding and sleep schedule was resumed. For the most part, all that SCP-6415 does is eat and sleep. There is, however, one notable exception. At random intervals, SCP-6415 will begin to cry, sobbing intensely and appearing to be in a state of overwhelming distress. Its cries are so loud that they can be heard from several halls away and have caused hearing damage in personnel in the room with it. There is no way to stop the creature from crying once it has started, though providing it with a hot cup of tea, a soft blanket, or a hug from a particularly brave and eager D-Class has caused it to cry a bit more quietly. Once it is finished crying after several hours of non-stop weeping, it will lie down on the ground and not cry anymore for weeks at a time. For a time, SCP-6415 was considered to be lacking human intelligence, and its containment procedures were changed to reflect that. It was held in the standard humanoid containment chamber in the light containment wing of Site-619, with soundproof walls. Because it displayed no threatening behavior, it was considered unnecessary to have any guards placed outside 6415's chamber. However, after Incident 6415-01, the Foundation's understanding of the creature changed dramatically. The incident occurred when several D-Class personnel were sent into 6415's containment chamber to feed it, and they found a harrowing sight. On the wall of the chamber, the entity had scratched a message with its fingernails. Its fingertips were bloodied and torn, its hands noticeably wounded from what must have been a great deal of effort. It did not acknowledge the personnel that entered the room. Instead, it just sat on the floor, staring at its work on the wall, cradling its injured hands and crying. Its shoulders shook with the force of its sobs, and its tears fell to the ground pooling around it. The D-Class personnel were later unable to report what they had seen without beginning to cry themselves, but eventually calmed down enough to report what the creature had written. Please bring them back. It was a desperate plea for the Foundation to somehow reunite it with its lost family. They had previously thought the creature to be a simple animal, incapable of understanding its own reality or communicating through clear language. This proved that the creature understood very well what had happened to it, and was feeling the loss of its loved ones fully. One D-Class officer noticed a scrap of paper, likely a piece of butcher paper from one of the creature's previous meals, with a picture drawn on it. It was a crude sketch, but its subject was easily recognizable. It was the southern Congo River where 6415 was first discovered, with 3 creatures splashing in the water. The largest one resembled SCP-6415, and it was swimming alongside a slightly smaller adult of its species and a much smaller creature that appeared to be a juvenile of the same species. Context clues indicated that this was a drawing of SCP-6415's family, its partner, and their child. At first, the Foundation researchers were uncertain who exactly the creature was referring to in its initial message, but this drawing made it perfectly clear. It wanted its family back. It is uncertain whether or not the creature is aware that its family is dead, but it clearly feels their absence just the same, and believes the Foundation might have the power to end its suffering. Foundation personnel who were exposed to the details of the incident became inconsolable, falling into a deep bout of depression brought on by a sense of shame and responsibility. When counseling sessions proved ineffective, the emotionally affected staff were given amnestics to wipe their memory of the incident, and of 6415 altogether. One employee, Research Assistant Cheryl Cruz, attempted to release the creature from its containment, insisting that it deserved to roam free. However, when she opened the door to its containment facility, the creature made no move to leave. It just stared at her, tears in its eyes as if it knew that it had nowhere else to go. Research Assistant Cruz was given a powerful amnestic and relieved of her position at the Foundation. Her current whereabouts are unknown. In order to prevent any more reckless behavior from sympathetic staff, the message scratched into the wall was painted over, and the sketch recovered from its chamber was destroyed. But even if the memories and evidence of the creature's pain are gone, anyone walking by its chamber can still hear it weeping. It is uncertain what the containment procedures for SCP-6415 will become. It is not simply an animal and clearly understands language, though it appears to be incapable of speech. If it could talk, whatever it said would surely be heartbreaking. For now, the entity remains in its cell, serving as a grim reminder of the guilt that weighs on the Foundation's conscience. No matter what they do with 6415, they cannot take back what they did. They cannot lift the weight of the creature's grief or bring back its lost family. It is the lone survivor sitting in its Foundation cell, weeping for its broken heart and begging the Foundation for the one thing it can never do: bring them back.
Help me! Would somebody please help me? I'm lost and I can't see!
It echoed through the alley in a thin, reedy voice that suggested brittleness of body and spirit. Who wouldn't hear that cry and feel a pang of sympathy? Are you so heartless that you'd ignore the desperate pleas for help of a blind man clearly in distress? For all you know, he might even be in danger. What if he walks into a road and gets hit by a car? Would you really want that on your conscience? Questions like these were flying through the head of the Good Samaritan when he decided to go and investigate, when it seemed like everyone else was just content to pretend they didn't hear it and carry on with their day as normal. The Good Samaritan was a person not unlike yourself. They were also the kind of person we all hoped and wished we would be in a situation such as this. Kindness and generosity is a virtue, after all. The problem is there are people out there who know this and are willing to take advantage of that kindness and generosity. But even worse is the fact that there are things that are definitely not people out there willing to take advantage of human compassion too. But back to the Good Samaritan. He approached the sound of the distressed man in the alley. He looked old and frail, hunched over with the weight of his years. He wore thick, dark glasses, and his white cane was laying on the road a few feet away from him. It was a tragic scene, but thankfully the Good Samaritan was here to help. He approached the old man calmly, telling him that it would be okay. The Good Samaritan picked up the walking cane and passed it over to the blind old man. His face spread into a warm smile and he said,
Thank you, young man. It warms my heart to know there are still good people like you on this earth.
The old man told the Good Samaritan that he'd come into town to get some fresh air and a little exercise, at which point he'd gotten lost. When the Good Samaritan asked whether it was safe for him to come alone, the old man told him that he always used to go on walks with his wife, but ever since the accident, she didn't seem to want to be seen in public. The Good Samaritan naturally felt for the old man, who seemed as sweet as he was feeble. He offered to escort the old man back to his house personally, wanting to make sure that he returned home safely. The old man smiled and graciously accepted, saying that his wife would probably want to thank the kind young man for helping him in person. Of course, the Good Samaritan was so wrapped up in the warm glow of doing a good deed that he never once stopped to question the strangeness of this whole situation. He just walked along with the old man, listening to him tell his fanciful stories as they left the city center and crept further into the sleepy outskirts of their small Kentucky town. He was just rambling on as old men tend to do. He told the Good Samaritan a little more about his beloved wife. She was a kind woman who'd he'd known for as long as he could remember. His elementary school sweetheart, then his high school girlfriend, and not long after they graduated, his beautiful blushing bride. Oh yes, she'd always been the prettiest lady, until the accident. Curiosity was getting the better of him. The Good Samaritan couldn't help but ask what exactly the accident he kept alluding to was, and the old man was all too happy to give him an answer. Not that this answer was in any way pleasant. His wife had been trapped in a terrible fire in town that gave her severe burns all over her body. She was lucky to be alive, but the flames took her beauty and her confidence away from her. Since then, she'd become a real homebody, often refusing to leave the house and rarely ever letting strangers see her. The Good Samaritan's heart ached for this poor old couple. Why were such nice people often forced to endure so much suffering? Did this old man even have anyone else to talk to? They reached his house soon enough. It was the furthest one on the end of the street, right next to the darkness of the woods. It looked old and dilapidated, but it wasn't like the old blind man could even know that. As they were walking up the small set of stairs to the porch, the old man stumbled slightly, causing his thick, dark glasses to fall to the floor. The Good Samaritan reflexively leaned over to pick up the glasses for the old man. As he passed them back, he noticed something strange. The old man wasn't just blind. He literally didn't have any eyes. Just two black, empty sockets where his eyes should be. The Good Samaritan was just thankful that the old man wasn't able to see him staring as he put the glasses back on. The two of them entered the house. The Good Samaritan was too busy thinking about the old man's empty eye sockets to even notice him locking the door behind them, and by then, it was already too late for him. The old man called out into the dark expanse of the house.
Sweetheart, I've got you a live one.
Before the Good Samaritan could ask what he actually meant by that, the old man shuffled off, deftly navigating the halls through memory alone, and took one of the two seats at the dining table. He just sat there, smiling, waiting. That's when the Good Samaritan heard the creaking sound coming from above, something moving up in the darkness of the second floor, and then descending the stairs with heavy, clomping footsteps. When his eyes came into focus in the dark, he saw it there, the most terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed, coming down the stairs towards him. It was vaguely human in its shape alone, but in all other respects, it was a monster through and through. This gnarled, twisted creature with bulging eyes, dead flesh, and filthy, exposed fangs, like it stepped straight out of a nightmare and into the physical world where it did not belong. There looked to be a huge hole in its lower torso too, with no blood or organs inside, just an infinite blackness. The creature's lipless mouth twisted into a smile. The creature said something in a voice that the Good Samaritan couldn't understand. It was the Black Tongue, something ancient, terrifying, and unknown. As the creature got closer and closer, the Good Samaritan turned and made a run for the door. He tried to figure out the lock, his hands fumbling and uncoordinated by fear. He could hear the footsteps and the heavy breathing of that thing getting closer behind him. He was so close, almost there. That's when a strange black substance seemed to encase the world around him. It separated him from the door he was so nearly able to breach, locking him in. He was trapped inside what looked like a giant black sphere made of some unknown material or energy. He turned to see that monster standing right behind him, just grinning and waiting for the inevitability of this situation to sink in. The Good Samaritan had never been more terrified. Something else began to shift inside the sphere. A structure was growing out of the ground up and around him like a cage within a cage. He was trapped and huddled inside a strange conical structure as more figures entered the sphere around him. They were just like the first, this horrible horde of desiccated not people, all with grinning, lipless mouths. When they closed in on him, the Good Samaritan had the one consolation that at least it was over. But it wasn't. Not yet. The blind old man waited in the kitchen for 5 hours as unmentionable horrors unfolded inside the black sphere. The Good Samaritan was actually lucky all in all, because for some sessions for victims inside the sphere had lasted as long as 27 hours. He screamed the entire time, with the sphere finally demanifesting just moments after the screaming stopped. Remaining was only one of the creatures, but no Good Samaritan. Just several neat piles of human organs, arranged by organ type.
Are you done in there, honey?
The blind old man asked.
I've been getting awfully hungry.
The creature replied in perfect English.
Yes, yeah. I think you want some supper before you go to bed.
The creature picked up some of the discarded organs and took them into the kitchen, where it began cooking them into a stew for the old man. He ate the stew not long after, blissfully ignorant to its contents, and went to sleep. Whatever organs from the Good Samaritan weren't used in the stew were simply thrown into the fireplace to burn away into ashes. Later that night, the old man would die peacefully of a heart attack in his sleep at age 81. He spent the latter 10 years of his life in service of SCP-957. He'd never even had a wife, and when the monster first invaded his home, he wasn't even blind. He'd simply come home one day to find SCP-957 lurking in his home, waiting for him. As far as the SCP Foundation is aware, it always targets people who live alone. The man had tried to resist, but the creature was freakishly strong in spite of its wiry frame. It grabbed him and forced his body into the dark gaping chasm of its chest. He was swallowed up into another world on the other side of the void and returned 4 hours later, a changed man. His eyes were gone, and he now firmly believed that SCP-957 was his beloved, if burnt-scarred wife of many years. He'd do anything for her, even heading out into the world and feigning distress to lure people back into her terrible clutches. That's how the old man became SCP-957-1. He wasn't the first, and wouldn't be the last. With the old man now dead, SCP-957 would demanifest and head off in search of a new victim, invading their home and repeating the cycle once more somewhere else. The somewhat happy ending is that in one of these cases, the SCP Foundation somehow got wise to the baiting activities of SCP-957, and they were able to contain the creature, giving it the Keter object class for its frequent attempts to either get out or lure in new victims. It's never been actively hostile to Foundation researchers and guards, just a little obtuse. Despite the fact that it's perfectly capable of speaking fluent English, it prefers to speak in an unknown dead language for somewhat mysterious reasons. Very little is known about the origins or true nature of SCP-957, but our brief glimpse into its interior life does little to comfort us. In 2008, the Foundation recorded 957 having a conversation with an unseen individual in its native tongue. Foundation linguistic experts have been able to partially crack the code on what was being said that day. 957 asked the unseen figure how much longer it would have to stay here. The figure told it that it would need to wait there for a while, and that its disguise was extremely convincing. 957 complained that being here was boring and tiresome, but the unseen figure urged 957 to remain patient. It said,
"We have to let them watch the few, so that the many can move freely. We will be done with our research soon enough."
Now go check out SCP-1861, the crew of the HMS Wintersheimer, and SCP-5049, the skin salesman Demon Dan's Discount Homunculus Depot, for more of the most terrifying anomalous beings out there.